Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. That particular night, it was a Friday, I think. I'd finished work around 5, grabbed a quick dinner and headed out around 10. I drove down this old logging road about 20 minutes from my house. It's a dirt track that cuts through a dense patch of state forest, and I've been going there for ages because the light pollution is almost zero. The sky gets so dark you can see the Milky Way stretched out like a dusty ribbon. I parked my car off to the side, about 2 miles down from the main highway, and set up my stuff. I didn't bring a telescope or anything fancy, just a blanket, a thermos of coffee, and my jacket. It was late September, so the air had that crisp, cold bite to it, the kind that makes your breath fog up and your fingers numb if you don't keep moving. I laid the blanket out on a small clearing near the edge of the trees. The ground was damp with dew, and I could feel the moisture seeping through the fabric after a while. The forest around me was alive with the usual night sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, leaves rustling in the breeze. It was comforting, familiar. I remember lying back and just staring up, picking out constellations. Orion was rising, and I could see Jupiter shining bright near the moon. For the first hour or so, it was perfect, peaceful. I sipped my coffee, felt the warmth spread through my chest, and let my mind wander. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just enjoying the silence and the vastness above me. But then, things started to feel off. I can't pinpoint exactly when it began, but the forest noises began to die down. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe an animal was moving through, or the wind shifted. But the crickets stopped, the owls went quiet. Even the breeze seemed to still. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the world. I sat up, feeling a little uneasy. I've been in the woods at night plenty of times, and it's never completely silent. There's always something. A frog, a distant coyote, something. But this was different. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I scanned the tree line, but it was pitch black beyond the first few feet. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, but the forest was a wall of shadows. I remember feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was that gut-deep kind of cold, the one that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was being silly. It's just the woods, right? Nothing to worry about. So I tried to focus back on the stars, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It's hard to describe. Like a prickle on the back of my neck, this sense that something was out there just beyond the trees, and it was focused on me. I must have been out there for another half hour, just sitting there, trying to ignore the creeping fear. My coffee was cold by then, and I was shivering, but not from the cold. It was adrenaline, I think. Every little sound, a twig snapping somewhere far off, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. But most of the time, it was dead quiet, eerily quiet. I kept telling myself to leave, but part of me was curious. Stupid, I know, but I've always been the type to see things through, even when I shouldn't. Then it happened. It was around 2 in the morning. I remember because I'd just checked my phone. No signal, of course, but the time was there. 2 o'clock. I was standing up, stretching my legs, thinking I should probably head back. That's when I heard it. Not a sound at first, but a movement. About 50 feet away to my left, there was this big pine tree. It was tall, maybe 40 or 50 feet high, thick around the base. Suddenly, it started shaking, not like in the wind. This was violent, aggressive. The whole tree was shuddering, branches whipping back and forth like something was shaking it with insane force. I froze. I couldn't move. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. There was no wind, no storm, nothing that could cause that. The shaking got more intense. I could hear the wood creaking, groaning under the strain. Then, with a sound I'll never forget, a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the silence. The tree snapped in half, not at the base, but about halfway up. The top part came crashing down, smashing through other branches and hitting the ground with a thud that I felt through my feet. The impact sent a cloud of pine needles and dirt flying into the air. I stood there, stunned, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could taste the dust in my mouth, smell the fresh sap and broken wood, but that wasn't the worst part. Right after the tree fell, there was this growl, deep, guttural, like nothing I've ever heard. It wasn't a bear. I've heard bears before, and this was different, deeper, more resonant, like it was coming from something much bigger. It vibrated through the air, low and menacing, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. My blood ran cold. I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me, so strong I thought I might pass out. My legs were shaking, and I had to grab onto my blanket to steady myself. The growl faded, and then nothing. Absolute silence again. The forest had gone still, like it was holding its breath. I stood there, paralyzed, staring into the darkness where the tree had been. My mind was racing. What the hell was that? A bear. But bears don't shake trees like that, and they don't growl that deep. Plus, there was no sign of any animal, no tracks, no movement, nothing. It was like whatever did it was invisible. I could still see the broken tree lying there, a dark shape against the forest floor. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like something was pressing down on me. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe a minute, maybe 5. Time seemed to stretch out. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. I knew I had to get out of there. Now! I scrambled to gather my stuff, my hands trembling so bad I could barely fold the blanket. I dropped my thermos, and the clatter made me jump again. I didn't bother picking it up. I just grabbed everything, threw it into the car, and fumbled for my keys. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept glancing back at the trees, expecting to see something emerge from the shadows, but there was nothing, just that eerie silence. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound of it roaring to life was a relief, but I still felt exposed. I flipped on the headlights, and the beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead and the edge of the forest. For a second, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shift in the shadows, something big and dark moving away. But it was gone so fast I couldn't be sure. Maybe it was my imagination, but I didn't stick around to find out. I slammed the car into gear and peeled out, kicking up gravel as I sped back down the road. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but the road was empty. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles were white. I couldn't stop shaking. Every noise from the car, the hum of the engine, the tires on the dirt, made me flinch. I replayed the whole thing in my head over and over. The tree shaking, the crack, the growl. It felt surreal, like a nightmare, but I knew it was real. I could still smell the pine sap on my clothes. When I got home, I ran inside and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on my couch, staring out the window, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I went back to the spot in daylight, but I didn't get out of the car. I could see the broken tree from the road, lying there in a heap. It was even more unsettling in the light. The break was clean, like it had been snapped by sheer force. There were no claw marks, no signs of an animal attack. Nothing. Just that broken tree and the memory of that growl. I've had other weird experiences in those woods before. Strange noises, things moving in the dark. Once I thought I saw something big and bipedal moving between the trees, but I always brushed it off as my imagination or a bear. But this was different. It was too aggressive, too purposeful. It felt like a warning, like whatever it was knew I was there and wanted me to know it was stronger, angrier. I haven't been back to that spot since. I can't. Every time I think about it, that fear comes rushing back. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a freak wind or a tree disease, but that growl, there's no explaining that growl. So yeah, that's my story. I don't know what it was, and I probably never will, but it's made me avoid that area altogether. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I'll hear a noise outside and my heart will start racing, and I'll remember that deep, guttural sound and the way the forest went dead silent after. It stuck with me, and I doubt it'll ever go away. Story 2. All right, I'm just going to type this out because I need to get it off my chest. I've never told this to anyone properly, not even my mates back then, because who would believe me? But it's been eating at me for years, and I figure if I don't share it somewhere, I might burst. So, here goes. My name's not important, but back in 1848, I was working as a shepherd for a bloke named W. Sutton out in Cunningham's Creek, Australia. It's a remote spot, nothing but rolling hills, dense scrub, and the occasional sheep station for miles. I'd been at it for a couple of years by then, so I knew the land pretty well, the way the wind whistled through the gum trees, the smell of dry grass and dust, the sounds of kookaburras laughing at dawn. It was a hard life, but it was simple. I had my dogs with me, 2 kelpies named Jack and Blue. They were tough as nails, fearless. We chased off dingoes, snakes, even a wild boar once without them so much as flinching. That's why what happened that day stuck with me so hard. It was a typical morning, early, maybe an hour after sunrise. The air was still cool, but you could feel the heat building up, promising another scorcher. I'd woken up in my rough-built hut, boiled some tea over the fire, and headed out with the flock. Sutton had me watching over about 200 sheep, moving them to graze in the northern paddocks. The scrub up there was thicker, lots of low bushes and tangled undergrowth, but the grass was greener, so it was worth the trek. Jack and Blue were trotting alongside, tails up, ears perked, usual stuff. I remember thinking it was going to be a quiet day. God, was I wrong. We reached the scrub around mid-morning. The sun was higher now, beating down, and the shadows from the trees were starting to shorten. I was leaning on my crook, keeping an eye on the sheep as they scattered to nibble at the grass. Jack and Blue were circling, keeping them in check. Everything felt normal. I could hear the bleating, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a crow. Then, out of nowhere, Jack stopped dead in his tracks. His ears flattened, and he let out this low growl I'd never heard from him before. Blue froze too, his body tense. At first I thought it might be a snake, or maybe a kangaroo hiding in the bushes. I squinted into the scrub, trying to see what had spooked them. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, through a gap in the trees, there was something moving. It was tall, way taller than a man, and covered in dark, shaggy hair. It was walking upright on 2 legs, like a person, but it wasn't human. No way. Its arms were long, swinging slightly as it moved, and it had a sort of lumbering gait, like it was heavy but steady. The hair was matted, almost black, and it gleamed in the patches of sunlight filtering through the trees. I couldn't make out its face clearly, it was too far. But I got the impression of a broad, heavy head, no neck to speak of. My heart just dropped into my stomach. I'd heard stories from other shearers about hairy men in the bush, but I'd always brushed them off as tall tales or drunk ramblings. Now, here it was, right in front of me. I stood there, frozen, my hand tightening on the crook. My mouth went dry, and I could feel this cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Part of me wanted to run, but another part was just stuck, watching. The creature didn't seem to notice me at first. It was just moving slowly, like it was foraging or something. Then it paused and turned its head in my direction. I didn't see its eyes, but I felt this chill run down my spine, like I was being watched by something ancient and wild. That's when the dogs lost it. Jack and Blue, who'd never backed down from anything, suddenly whimpered and bolted. Not just a little scare, I mean full-on panic. Their tails were clamped between their legs, ears flat, and they scrambled back toward me, almost tripping over each other. Jack bumped into my leg, and I could feel him trembling. Blue let out this high-pitched whine, like he was begging me to get us out of there. I'd never seen them like that. They were brave dogs, the kind that would have taken on a pack of dingoes without a second thought. But this thing, it terrified them. That scared me more than the sight of the creature itself. If my dogs were that afraid, what the hell was I dealing with? I grabbed Jack's collar, my hands shaking, and pulled him close. Blue pressed against my other leg, whining softly. The sheep had started to bunch up, sensing the tension. A few of them bleated nervously, shifting around. I kept my eyes on the hairy man, expecting it to charge or something, but it just stood there, watching us. Then, after what felt like an eternity, probably only a few seconds, it turned and moved deeper into the scrub, disappearing into the shadows. The way it moved was so smooth, so quiet, like it belonged there in a way I never could. As soon as it was gone, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I felt lightheaded, like I might pass out. The dogs were still shaking, pressing against me for comfort. I patted them absently, my mind racing. What was that thing? A bear? No, we don't have bears in Australia. A large kangaroo. But kangaroos don't walk upright like that, not for long. This thing was built like a man, but bigger, hairier, wilder. The stories flooded back. The yowie, some called it, or just hairy men. I'd laughed them off before, but now I wasn't laughing. I knew I had to get out of there. I whistled to the dogs, my voice shaky, and started herding the sheep back toward the hut. Normally the dogs would help, but they were too spooked, so I had to do most of the work myself. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark shape following us. The walk back felt twice as long. The sun was high overhead now, hot and relentless, but I was cold inside. My clothes were damp with sweat and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I could still picture that thing in my mind, the way it moved, the sheer size of it. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen, and I've spent most of my life in the bush. When I got back to the hut, I secured the sheep in the pen and went inside. The dogs followed me, sticking close, their usual confidence gone. I sat down on my bunk, my legs feeling like jelly. I needed to tell someone, but who? Sutton was the obvious choice, but he was a practical man, not one for nonsense. Still, I had to try. Later that afternoon, once I'd calmed down a bit, I saddled up my horse and rode over to the main station. Sutton was in his office, going over ledgers. I remember the smell of tobacco and old paper, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight from the window. I told him everything, stumbling over my words. I described the hairy man, how the dogs reacted, how it just vanished. He listened, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You sure it wasn't a feral bloke or something? Maybe one of the locals playing a prank," he said. I shook my head. "No, sir, this wasn't a man. It was too big, too hairy. And the dogs, they've never been scared like that." He rubbed his chin, thoughtful. "Well, I'll make a note of it, but there's not much we can do. If it's out there, it's probably harmless. Just keep an eye out." That was it. No further action, no investigation. I felt dismissed, like I'd wasted his time. I rode back to my hut, feeling even more unsettled. The rest of the day dragged on. I tried to go about my chores, feeding the dogs, checking the sheep, but my mind kept wandering back to that scrub. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise louder. As evening fell, the sky turned orange and purple, and the air cooled down. I built a fire outside, more for comfort than warmth. Jack and Blue sat beside me, still jumpy. I kept looking north, toward where I'd seen it, half expecting to see it standing there watching me. But there was nothing, just the endless bush, silent and mysterious. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the hut, Every rustle outside had me bolting upright. I'd lie there in the dark, listening, my heart pounding. The image of that hairy man was burned into my brain. I kept thinking about how it moved, so effortlessly, like it was part of the land itself. And the dogs. Their fear was real, raw. It wasn't something I could forget. In the days that followed, I avoided that northern scrub as much as I could. Sutton never brought it up again, and I didn't push it. Life went on, but it was different. I was more cautious, more aware of the sounds around me. Sometimes when I was out with the flock, I'd catch a movement in the corner of my eye and freeze. But it was always nothing, a bird, a kangaroo, the wind. But that one day, that one sighting, it changed something in me. I'd always felt at home in the bush, but now there was this undercurrent of fear, this sense that we're not alone out here. To this day, I don't know what I saw, a hairy man, a yowie, something else. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it was real, at least to me. It's been years, and I've left shepherding behind, but I still dream about it sometimes. That upright walk, the dark hair, the way my dogs cowered. I never saw it again, and no one ever caught it or proved it existed. It's just out there, a mystery that unsettled not just me, but the whole area in a way. People talk about strange noises or missing livestock, and I wonder, but I'll never forget that day. It's like a ghost in my memory, always lurking, reminding me that there are things in this world we can't explain. And that's it. That's what happened. I still don't have answers, and I doubt I ever will. Story 3. Okay, so I've never really shared this with anyone before, not in full detail, because honestly, who would believe me? But I've been sitting on this for a while now, and I need to get it out there. Maybe someone else has seen something similar, or maybe I'm just losing it. But I swear this happened to me. It was one of those days that starts out perfectly normal, and then just isn't. I'm still shaken up thinking about it, and it's been on my mind ever since. Let me set the scene. This was last fall, I think it was early October, on a Saturday. I'd driven out to the Hoh River in Washington, way out in the Olympic Peninsula, to do some fishing. I'd been there a bunch of times before. It's this quiet kind of remote spot where you can just unwind and not see another soul for hours. That day, I woke up before dawn, grabbed my gear, and headed out. The drive was peaceful, just me and the empty roads, with the fog still clinging to the trees. By the time I got to my usual spot, the sun was barely up, and the whole place was wrapped in this thick grey mist. It was so quiet, you know. Not like dead silence, but that hushed, almost sacred kind of quiet where you can hear the river gurgling and the leaves rustling in the breeze. I remember thinking how perfect it was, just me and the water. I parked my truck off the dirt road, about a 5-minute walk from the riverbank. The air was cool and damp, and I could smell that wet earth and pine scent that always makes me feel grounded. I set up my fishing spot on a little gravel bar that juts out into the river. The Hoh isn't huge there, maybe 30 or 40 feet across, but it's deep in spots and the current moves fast. I'd brought my spinning rod and a small tackle box, nothing fancy. I just wanted to catch a few trout and maybe clear my head for a bit. So I'm there, casting my line, watching the mist swirl over the water. It must have been about half an hour into it, and I was starting to relax. My mind was wandering, thinking about work, stuff at home, the usual. Then I glanced across the river, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was another fisherman. I mean, why wouldn't I? It was standing upright, moving along the opposite bank, kind of slow and steady. The mist made it hard to see clearly, but I could make out a tall, dark shape. I remember feeling a little annoyed, like, great, someone else is here to ruin my solitude. But then I figured, whatever, it's a public area. But as I kept watching, something felt off. The way it moved, it wasn't like a person walking. It had this long, heavy stride, almost like it was dragging its feet a little, but with purpose. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The mist would thin out for a second, then roll back in, so it was like glimpses here and there. I noticed it wasn't carrying anything. No rod, no backpack, nothing. And it was big, like really big. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing made me feel small just from across the river. My heart started beating a little faster, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a hiker or something. But then it stopped near the water's edge, and that's when things got weird. The mist cleared enough for me to see it more clearly, and I realized it was covered in hair, dark brown, almost black, and it looked thick, like fur, not like a bear. Bears don't stand like that. This thing was upright, with massive shoulders that sloped down, and its arms hung low, way lower than a person's. I felt this cold knot form in my stomach. I'd heard stories, about Bigfoot, but I always brushed them off as nonsense. Now I wasn't so sure. I froze, my fishing rod still in my hand, the line dangling in the water. I didn't want to move, didn't want to draw attention to myself. The figure was just standing there, maybe 50 feet away across the river, and it turned its head slightly. I couldn't see its face clearly because of the distance and the mist, but I got the sense it was looking around. Then it crouched down, not like a human crouch. It was more fluid, like its legs just folded under it without any effort, and its arms. God, its arms were so long. When it reached into the river, one arm extended out, and I swear it was longer than any human arm I've ever seen. It was thick, muscular, and covered in that same dark hair. It started splashing around in the water, not like it was washing something, but like it was trying to grab something. The sound was odd, a heavy, sloshing noise that carried over the river's gentle flow. I could see the water churning where its hand was, and it moved with a kind of deliberate, almost curious motion. My mind was racing. What was it doing? Was it fishing? But it didn't have any tools, just its hand. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the hairs on my arms stood up. I was gripping my fishing rod so tight my knuckles hurt. Then, the worst part happened. It stopped splashing and turned its head toward me. Not fully, just a slight turn, but enough that I could see its profile. And that's when we made eye contact. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt it. This intense, primal fear that shot through me like electricity. Its eyes were dark, set deep under a heavy brow, and even from that distance, I could feel them locked on me. Time seemed to slow down. I couldn't look away. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt like I was going to vomit. It was like it was sizing me up, and in that moment I knew it wasn't human. Nothing human could have that presence. It held my gaze for what felt like forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. Then, slowly, it stood up, and when it did, I realized how tall it was, towering, easily over 7 feet, maybe more. Its chest was broad and muscular, and it seemed to fill the space around it. It didn't make a sound, no grunt or growl, just this silent, powerful movement. It took a couple of steps up the bank, its feet sinking into the gravel with a soft crunch that I could hear even over the river. Each step was deliberate, heavy, like it weighed a ton. I was still frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then, without another glance my way, it disappeared into the tree line. Just like that. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the dense woods. The mist seemed to close in again, and the quiet returned, but it felt different now, oppressive, like the air was heavier. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe a minute or two, but eventually I snapped out of it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely reel in my line. I fumbled with the rod, almost dropping it, and my mind was a jumble of thoughts. What the hell was that? Did I really see that? I kept glancing back at the opposite bank, half expecting it to reappear, but there was nothing, just the river and the mist. I packed up my gear in a hurry, stuffing everything into my backpack without caring how messy it was. My movements were jerky, panicked. I kept looking over my shoulder, my senses on high alert. Every little sound, a bird chirping, a branch cracking, made me jump. I felt like I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anything. The walk back to my truck felt like miles, even though it was only a few minutes. My legs were weak, and I had to stop a couple of times to catch my breath. I remember the gravel crunching under my boots, and how loud it seemed, like I was announcing my presence to everything around me. When I got to my truck, I threw my gear in the back and climbed into the driver's seat. My hands were still trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I started the engine and just sat there for a second, taking deep breaths. The cab felt safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I drove off, not even bothering to check my mirrors until I was back on the main road. The whole way home, my mind kept replaying what I'd seen, the way it moved, the eye contact, that long arm reaching into the water. It was burned into my brain. I've been back to the Ho River a few times since then, mostly because I love fishing there, but I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I'll catch myself staring at the opposite bank, half hoping and half dreading to see something, but it's always just the trees and the water. I've talked to a couple of friends about it, but they just laugh it off or say I must have seen a bear. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that, don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't make eye contact like that. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't know what it was, but it was real, and every time I think about it, I get that same chill, that same fear. It's like a shadow that followed me home, and I can't shake it. I just had to put this out there, in case someone else has felt that same terror. Because if you have, you know it's not something you forget, ever. Story 4. All right, I'll just get right into it. I don't know how else to talk about this, and I don't even know what it was. I just need to write it down somewhere, because it's been stuck in my head for weeks now, and I can't shake the feeling, I can't explain it, and I don't think I ever will. So, back in late September, my life hit a rough patch. My landlord decided to sell the place I was renting, and I had a 2-week gap before I could move into my new spot. I didn't have family nearby or friends with a spare room, and I sure as hell couldn't afford a motel for 2 whole weeks. So I did what I had to do. I packed a duffel bag with some clothes, a cooler with whatever food I had left, and I loaded up my dog, Rex, into my beat-up old SUV. I'm not some survivalist. I'm just a guy. I work in a warehouse. My idea of camping is a state park with a fire ring and a picnic table. But I knew a place. It was out past the edge of town, a good 45-minute drive down a dirt logging road that eventually turned to little more than a pair of ruts in the grass. It's a spot I'd used for years to do a little target shooting. A big old gravel pit carved into the side of a hill, surrounded by dense Idaho forest. It's secluded, quiet, and most importantly, nobody ever goes out there, especially not after dark. It felt safe, or at least it always had before. The first night was fine, a little cold, but quiet. I slept in the back of my SUV with Rex curled up at my feet. It was uneventful. The second night, that was the one. That was last night for me. The one that's burned into my brain. I'd spent the day just killing time, driving around, trying to stay warm. It gets cold fast in Idaho once the sun goes down in the fall. By the time I pulled back into the gravel pit that evening, it was already full dark. The kind of dark you only get miles from any town, where the blackness is a physical thing, thick and heavy. I had my headlights on, cutting 2 lonely beams across the sea of grey gravel and the dark wall of trees that circled the pit. I parked in my usual spot, right up against the high gravel bank, figuring it would block some of the wind. I made a pathetic dinner of a cold hot dog and some chips, shared a bit with Rex, and then I just sat there. The silence was absolute. No crickets, no wind, nothing. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. To fight the boredom and the creeping unease, I decided to watch a movie on my phone. I had it propped up on the dashboard, some dumb action movie I'd downloaded, the sound tinny through the phone speaker. Rex was in the back seat, lying down, seemingly asleep. I was maybe 20 minutes into the movie when I felt a shift in the car. Not a sound, just a movement. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Rex was standing up on the back seat. He's a big dog, a German Shepherd mix, about 90 pounds of solid muscle and goofy energy. He's not a nervous dog. He's scared of vacuum cleaners, and that's about it. But he was standing there, stiff, his ears pitched forward, his head cocked. He was staring out the back window, into that absolute blackness behind the car. I paused my movie. "What's up, buddy?" I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet car. He didn't look at me. He let out this low whine, not a bark, not a growl, just this strained, high-pitched sound from the back of his throat that I'd never heard before. It was a sound of pure distress. Then, in one clumsy, frantic motion, he launched himself from the back seat, over the center console, and into the passenger seat next to me. He didn't just lie down. He curled himself into the tightest ball he could possibly make, tucking his head down, and he pressed his entire body against my leg, trembling. I mean, full-body shivers, like he was standing in a freezer. This was so far from his normal behavior, it was alarming. If he's scared, he usually just comes and leans on me. He doesn't turn into a trembling, compact ball of fear. I reached out and put my hand on his back. His fur was bristled, standing straight up all along his spine. He was tense as a rock. "Hey, what is it, boy? You hear something?" I rolled down my window a crack, just an inch. The cold night air rushed in. I listened. Nothing. No rustling leaves, no cracking twigs, no animal calls, just that heavy, suffocating silence. I didn't smell anything either. No skunk, no decay, nothing, just clean, cold pine air. I sat there for a bit, my hand on Rex's back, feeling him tremble. My heart was starting to beat a little faster. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a moose or an elk wandering too close. They're big. They can spook a dog. But Rex had seen moose before. He'd barked at them. He'd never reacted like this. This was a different kind of fear. This was the kind of fear that's silent and deep. I looked at my phone. About 5, maybe 10 minutes had passed since he'd jumped up front. I was just starting to think about maybe turning the car on, just to have the dome light on for a bit. When it happened, it wasn't a sound, it was a force. Something pushed down on the back of my SUV. I'm not talking about a little bump. I'm not talking about the car rocking. I'm talking about a single violent downward jolt. It was so hard and so sudden that the entire frame of the vehicle groaned. The back end dropped what felt like a solid foot. My head snapped back against the headrest. The stuff in the back, my duffel bag, the cooler, all slid and crashed into the rear hatch. My phone tumbled off the dashboard and landed in the passenger footwell. The movement was so definitive, so physical. It was like a giant had put its hand on the back bumper and just leaned all its weight down in one sharp, brutal motion. My heart didn't just beat faster. It felt like it stopped. A cold jolt of pure adrenaline shot through my body, from my feet to the top of my head. My breath caught in my throat. For a second, I just froze, my brain refusing to process what had just happened. Rex? He didn't move, he didn't lift his head, he didn't bark. He just let out another one of those pathetic, strangled whines and pressed himself harder against my leg, trembling even more violently. He knew, whatever it was, he knew it was still there. My mind was screaming. What the hell was that? A bear? Did a bear just jump on my car? But it didn't feel like an animal jumping. It felt like a deliberate, single-handed push. And it was quiet. There was no impact sound, no grunt, no heavy thud. Just the groan of my car's suspension and the crash of my stuff inside. I had to look. I had to. My body felt numb, but I forced myself to move. I slowly, so slowly, turned my head to look out the back window. Nothing, pure, unbroken blackness. My tail lights were off, so there was no red glow. It was just a void. I couldn't see the gravel, I couldn't see the trees, I couldn't see anything. It was like the back of my car was pressed up against a wall of ink. I fumbled for the button, to turn on the interior dome light. My fingers were shaking so bad I missed it twice. I finally hit it, and a weak, yellowy light filled the car. It didn't help. It just made the darkness outside the windows seem even deeper, more impenetrable. I was a lit-up fishbowl in the middle of a black ocean. I stared into that darkness, my eyes straining, trying to pick out a shape, a shadow, anything. There was nothing, no movement, no glint of eyes, no sound, no heavy breathing, no footsteps crunching on the gravel. Nothing. That was almost worse than seeing something. If I'd seen a bear, I'd have been terrified, but I'd have known what it was. This was nothing. An invisible force that had just demonstrated its power and then vanished back into the night without a trace. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my body rigid. Rex was a statue of fear beside me. I kept expecting it to happen again. I kept waiting for a shape to loom up at a window, for the car to be rocked side to side. Every tiny sound my body made, the creak of my seat, the sound of my own swallowing, was magnified 1,000 times. I thought about starting the car and just peeling out of there. But my brain, working in slow motion, offered up a terrible thought. What if it was standing right behind the car? I'd run it over. What if that made it angry? The image of this invisible, powerful thing grabbing onto my bumper as I tried to speed away flashed in my mind. I was paralyzed by indecision, frozen by a fear so primal I didn't have a name for it. So I just sat and waited. The dome light stayed on. I didn't dare turn it off. I kept glancing at my mirrors, at the side windows, seeing nothing but my own pale, wide-eyed reflection staring back at me. An hour passed, maybe more. It was hard to tell time. It felt like a lifetime. My legs were cramping from being tensed up for so long. The initial shock had worn off, leaving behind a deep, gnawing dread that sat in the pit of my stomach like a cold stone. Rex finally started to relax a little. The trembling had subsided to an occasional shiver. He lifted his head and looked at me, his eyes still wide and worried. Then he looked towards the door and gave a little huff. He had to pee. Of course he did. He'd been cooped up for hours. A new wave of panic washed over me. I had to let him out. There was no choice. But the idea of opening that door, of either of us being outside the relative safety of this metal box, was terrifying. I tried to reason with myself. It had been over an hour. If something was out there, it was surely gone by now. Maybe it was just a bear, and it had wandered off. My logical mind was desperately trying to reclaim control from my animal fear. "Okay, buddy," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Quick, in and out." I took a deep, shaky breath. I hit the button to unlock the doors. The thunk of the locks disengaging was deafening. I leaned over Rex and pushed the passenger door open, just a foot or so. "Go on, go pee." He didn't need to be told twice. He slithered out of the crack in the door and hit the ground. I watched him, my heart in my throat. He didn't run off to find his favorite spot. He didn't sniff around. He walked about 3 feet from the car, lifted his leg, and emptied his bladder in one long, continuous stream. The second he was done, he didn't even shake off. He spun around and practically launched himself back into the car, scrambling over me to get back to the passenger seat, where he immediately curled back into a ball, though not quite as tightly as before. He was back inside in less than 15 seconds. It was the fastest, most businesslike bathroom break I'd ever seen him take. He knew. He knew it wasn't safe out there. His behavior confirmed everything my fear had been screaming at me. Something was out there. Something that had pushed a 3,000-pound vehicle down like it was a toy. Something that made a brave dog too scared to bark, too scared to do anything but hide and tremble. Something that moved in utter silence and left no trace. I pulled the door shut and locked it again. The rest of the night was a special kind of hell. I didn't sleep a wink. I just sat there in the driver's seat, staring into the darkness, jumping at every imagined shadow. The cold seeped in, but I was too scared to start the car and run the heater, worried the noise would attract attention. I just bundled up in my jacket and shivered, a combination of the cold and the residual terror. The dawn was the longest, slowest thing I've ever witnessed. The black outside the windows slowly turned to dark grey, then to a pale, sickly light. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I looked out the back window. The gravel was undisturbed. No footprints, no giant bear tracks. No marks from where something massive had stood. There was nothing. It was just a normal gravel pit on a cold, grey morning. I started the car. The engine turning over was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I didn't even wait for it to warm up. I threw it into drive and spun the tires, spitting gravel behind me as I sped out of that pit and didn't look back. I've turned that night over in my head 1,000 times. A bear would have made noise. It would have left tracks. A moose would have been seen. A person would have said something or at least been heard walking away. This was none of those things. It was a silent, powerful, invisible presence that knew we were there and wanted us to know it was there too. I'm in my new apartment now. The walls feel thin, but I still lock the deadbolt 3 times every night, and I still can't explain what pushed my car down that night. I just know that it did, and I know that my dog knew what it was, and he was more afraid of it than I've ever seen him be of anything in his life. And that's a feeling I don't think I'll ever forget. The feeling of being prey, the feeling of being watched by something you can't see. Something that could crush you without even making a sound. Story 5. It was late October, a Friday. Me and my buddy, we'd been planning this deer scouting trip for weeks. We weren't hunting yet, just looking for signs, trying to find where the big bucks were bedding down for the season. We both had the weekend off, a rare thing. So we loaded up his truck and headed out towards the Goat Rocks Wilderness, east part of Lewis County. The place we picked was off this old logging road, one of those gated ones that's technically closed but everyone uses anyway. It was familiar ground. We'd been there before in the summer, but never this late in the year. We got there right as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The air had that crisp, cold bite to it that tells you winter isn't far off. We found a decent spot to camp, a little pull-out area that was mostly level, surrounded by tall, dark firs. Below us, the ground fell away steeply into what looked like an old clear-cut. It was a mess of blackberry bushes, fallen logs, and young alders fighting their way back up, all shadowy and thick. You couldn't see more than 20-30 feet into it before the darkness just swallowed everything. We got the tent set up quick, both of us working in that quiet, efficient way you do when the temperature is dropping. We built a fire, not a big roaring one, just a decent campfire to keep the chill off and to cook some hot dogs we'd brought. That part was normal. It was peaceful. The sky was clear, the stars were coming out, and it was so quiet you could hear the sap cracking in the logs on the fire. We were just sitting there on our coolers, passing a flask of whiskey back and forth, talking in low voices about work, about nothing important. It was a good night, right up until it wasn't. The first thing that changed was the woods got quiet. I didn't even realize it at first. But then I noticed the crickets had stopped. There were no more little rustles in the leaves. It was like someone had hit a mute button. I remember feeling a little prickle on the back of my neck, but I shrugged it off. Maybe an owl or something had spooked the smaller critters. Then the noise started. It came from down the slope in that thick, overgrown clear-cut. At first it was just a crash, like a big branch snapping. We both looked at each other. "Bear," my friend said, and I nodded. Because that's what you think. It's always a bear. But then there was another crash, and then another, and it didn't sound like a bear knocking over a rotten log. This sounded like ripping. Like something was just tearing saplings right out of the ground. There was this grunting sound, a heavy, wet-sounding huff, like a huge animal that was pissed off and working hard. We stood up. The fire was between us and the edge of the slope, and we were just staring into that wall of blackness. The crashing kept going, getting more violent. It wasn't random. It sounded focused. Like whatever it was systematically destroying something. Then we heard the thudding, heavy, solid thuds that you could feel in your chest. It wasn't a log falling. This was different. It was the sound of something being thrown, something heavy. The first one hit with a deep whoomp that vibrated through the ground. Then another, closer this time. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I was going to be sick. I could feel the blood draining from my face. My friend's eyes were wide, reflecting the firelight. He looked terrified. I'd never seen him look like that. We're both big guys. We've been in the woods our whole lives. But this was a different kind of fear. This was a deep, primal fear that starts in your gut and just floods your whole body. We were frozen, just listening to this thing tear apart the hillside. It was maybe 200 yards away, but in the dead quiet of the night it sounded like it was right on top of us. The huffing and grunting was constant now, a rhythm to its rage. And then it stopped. The silence was somehow worse. It was absolute. The forest was holding its breath. We were holding our breath. I could hear the blood roaring in my ears. We didn't move, didn't speak. We just stared into the dark, waiting. That's when the scream started. It wasn't an animal sound I'd ever heard. It wasn't a cougar's shriek or an elk's bugle. This was guttural, low at first. Then it rose into this wavering, piercing shriek that seemed to cut right through me. It was loud, unbelievably loud, and it didn't sound like it came from a throat. It sounded like it came from a cavern. It was a scream of pure, raw fury. The hair on my arms and on the back of my neck stood straight up. My scalp was crawling. I felt cold all over, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the chill in the air. The scream went on and on for what felt like minutes. It would dip low, then soar back up, wavering in this horrible way that made my teeth ache. It wasn't just hearing it, I could feel it. The sound vibrated in my chest, in the fillings of my teeth. It was a physical pressure. My friend took a step back, his mouth hanging open. I think I might have been whimpering. I'm not ashamed to admit it. That sound was not of this world. It was wrong. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any silence I've ever experienced. It was a dead quiet, a void. There were no crickets, no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like the world had been erased. That was the most terrifying part. The chaos was bad, the scream was worse. But this silence, this was the thing that broke me. It was a listening silence. It felt like whatever had made that sound was now standing perfectly still, waiting, listening for us. That's when we moved. There was no discussion. We both scrambled at the same time. We didn't even think about the tent or the coolers or the fire. Our only thought was the truck. My friend's keys were in his pocket. We ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, our boots slipping on the damp needles. I've never felt so clumsy, so exposed. My back was a giant target, and I was sure that at any second something huge and dark was going to come crashing out of the clear-cut and grab me. We reached the truck, a beat-up Ford F-150. My friend fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so bad he dropped them on the ground. I snatched them up, my own hands weren't much better, and I unlocked the doors. We piled in, slamming the doors shut and hitting the locks in one frantic motion. The sound of the locks clicking into place was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. We sat there panting, staring out the windshield at our camp. The fire was still going, casting these long, dancing shadows that now looked menacing. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every stump looked like a crouching figure. "We need the rifles," my friend whispered. His voice was hoarse. They were in the back, in hard cases. Going back out there was the last thing I wanted to do, but the thought of being in that truck, in that silence, without a weapon, was even worse. We looked at each other, and without a word, we made a decision. We'd do it together. Fast. He unlocked the doors. "On three," he said. "1, 2, 3. We burst out of the truck, ran to the tailgate. He yanked it down. The cases were right there. We grabbed them, clumsy in our panic, and scrambled back into the cab, slamming the doors and locking them again. My heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. We sat there for a second, just breathing, clutching the rifle cases to our chests like they were life preservers. We didn't even take the rifles out. Just having the cases with us, knowing they were right there, made us feel a tiny bit better. A tiny bit. Then we waited. We didn't talk. What was there to say? We just sat, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The silence persisted. It was an hour, maybe 2. I don't know. Time stopped having any meaning. We'd hear a normal night sound, the call of a distant owl, the sigh of the wind in the highest branches, and we'd both jump, our heads snapping towards the noise. But the clear cut remained silent. Impossibly silent. We tried to reason it out in hushed tones. A bear? No, not with that scream, not with that kind of destructive power. A moose? There aren't moose there. A person? No person could make a sound like that or throw things that made the ground shake from 200 yards away. We went through every logical possibility, and every one of them fell apart. That's when my friend, his face pale in the green glow of the truck's dashboard lights, said the word for the first time: Sasquatch. I didn't laugh. I didn't argue. In that moment, in that suffocating silence, it was the only thing that made any sense. The sheer size of the sound, the power, the intelligence behind the focused destruction, the otherworldly quality of that scream. It fit. It fit in a way that made my blood run cold. The rest of the night was the longest of my life. We took turns trying to sleep, but neither of us managed more than a few minutes of fitful dozing. Every creak of the truck settling, every snap from the dying fire jolted us awake, gripping the rifle cases until our knuckles were white. We had the heaters on, blowing lukewarm air, but I was shivering from the inside out, a deep, bone-level chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We watched the sky through the windshield. We watched the stars slowly wheel their way across the blackness, counting the minutes until the first hint of grey would appear in the east. That night, I learned what true, undiluted terror feels like. It's not a jump scare. It's a slow, grinding dread that sits in your stomach and climbs up your spine, a constant humming awareness that you are not at the top of the food chain, that you are prey. Finally, after an eternity, the blackness began to soften to a deep blue. Then a sliver of grey light appeared on the horizon. First light. It was the most beautiful and relieving thing I have ever seen. As soon as we could make out shapes clearly, we got out of the truck. The air was freezing, and our breath plumed in the dawn light. We didn't speak. We just started breaking camp, moving fast, our eyes constantly darting towards that clear-cut slope. We threw the tent, the coolers, everything, into the bed of the truck in a messy heap. We didn't care about folding anything. We just wanted to be gone. I took one last look down that slope as we were about to leave. In the flat, grey morning light, it just looked like a messy, overgrown hillside. There was no sign of the chaos from the night before, no huge footprints in the mud near our camp, no broken trees we could see from our vantage point. Nothing. It was just normal, and that was almost more disturbing. It was like the whole thing had been a shared nightmare, except I could still feel the vibration of that scream in my bones. We got in the truck. My friend started the engine, and we drove out of there. We didn't say a single word the whole way back to the main road. We just listened to the tires on the gravel and were grateful for the noise. It took me weeks to feel normal again. I'd jump at loud noises. I couldn't sleep with the window open. A few months later, my friend sent me a link to a video online. It was a recording someone had made in the North Cascades, a supposed Sasquatch scream. When I played it, my blood went cold. It wasn't exactly the same. Ours was deeper, more guttural, more full of rage, but the structure was there. That same wavering, piercing quality, that same feeling of it being too big, too primal, to be anything we know. We never went back to that spot. We don't even talk about that trip much. But I think about it all the time. I think about the silence that came after the scream. I think about what it was doing down there in the dark. And I think about what would have happened if we hadn't been up by the road, if we'd been down in that clear cut with it. I know what I believe we heard. I know it in my gut. And sometimes, on a really quiet night, when the house is still and the world outside is silent, I'll remember that dead, listening quiet, and I'll feel that old fear tap me on the shoulder just to let me know it's still there. Story 6. It was the summer of 1998, probably late June, or maybe early July. I remember it was hot down in Port Angeles, the kind of wet heat that makes your shirt stick to your back. I was young, stupid, and thought I was invincible. I'd driven out to the Olympic Peninsula on a whim, just to get away for a couple days. I stopped at this little outdoor supply place to rent a decent backpack and a warmer sleeping bag than the one I had. The guy behind the counter was old. Looked like he'd been hiking these mountains since they were hills. He was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, not even looking at me while he rang me up. He asked where I was headed, and I told him I was thinking of going up past the fire line, find a spot to camp for the night. He stopped sharpening the knife then and looked right at me. His eyes were this pale, watery blue, and they didn't blink. "You got guts, kid," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Or you're an idiot. Up there alone, things get quiet, too quiet. You hear things you can't explain." He leaned forward, the wood of the counter creaking. "I dare you to spend the whole night. Bet you $50 you come running back down before sunrise." It was a stupid dare. I was 22, and $50 was a decent amount of money then. But it was more about the pride. I just laughed it off, paid for my rental, and told him he'd lose his money. The hike up was beautiful, I'll give it that. The air was clean and cool as I gained elevation, a relief from the stuffy heat below. The trees were massive, these ancient firs and cedars that made you feel tiny. The sunlight came down in shafts, lighting up patches of ferns and moss. I was making good time, my boots crunching on the dry, rocky soil. I felt good, strong. I remember thinking the old guy was just trying to spook me, some local legend nonsense to scare the tourists. I found my spot a couple hours before dusk. It was a secluded area, well above where most casual hikers would stop, in a kind of natural bowl surrounded by steep slopes. The ground was soft with decades of fallen needles, and right in the middle of this clearing was this huge, ancient tree. I don't know what kind it was, but its trunk was wider than my car. The roots were like massive, knotted serpents, breaking out of the earth, and the branches didn't go up so much as they swept down. Long and heavy, some of them brushing the ground, creating a kind of dark, private space underneath. It felt like a ready-made shelter. I decided to set up my tent right under those sweeping branches, using one of the bigger roots as a sort of backstop. I got the tent pitched, unrolled my sleeping bag, and got a small, contained fire going in a ring of stones I made. I ate a can of beans and some jerky, watching the sky turn from blue to deep purple. That's when the quiet started. The old man was right. Down lower, you always hear something. Birds, the distant hum of a car, something. Up here, once the sun started to go, the silence was a physical thing. It was heavy. It pressed in on my ears. I doused the fire completely before turning in, careful to scatter the ashes and stones. I'm not an idiot. I know about forest fires. The dark that came after was absolute. No moon, no city glow, just a blanket of black so thick I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. That's when I heard the first sounds. It wasn't anything scary at first. It was deer, I'm sure of it. I could hear their soft, careful steps on the pine needles, the occasional snort. They were nosing around my campsite, probably smelling the food I'd stored in my pack. which I'd hung from a high branch away from the tent. I remember feeling a little annoyed, worried they'd somehow get to it. I must have drifted off to sleep with that thought, the sound of their gentle foraging somehow comforting. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was still pitch black, but I was instantly completely awake. My heart was already hammering in my chest before my brain even registered why. There was a new sound. It was a footstep, but not a deer's. This was different. This was heavy, so heavy I could feel the vibration through the ground, a soft thump that traveled up through the floor of my tent and into my bones. Crunch. A slow, deliberate step on the dry ground. It was close, right outside my tent. I froze. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, my ears straining, every muscle in my body locked tight. My sleeping bag felt like it was suffocating me. Crunch. Another step. It was circling. I could hear it moving around the perimeter of my small campsite. The steps had a rhythm to them, a slow, confident pace that was utterly terrifying. This wasn't a curious deer. A deer is skittish. This thing wasn't skittish. It was investigating. I slowly, so slowly it felt like it took an hour, turned my head on the pillow. My tent had a small mesh window. I couldn't see anything but blackness. The sound kept going. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. It made a full circuit. Then it stopped, right where I'd had my fire ring. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. My heart was beating so hard I was sure it could hear it. I was sweating, a cold, clammy sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. I was praying, begging whatever it was to just move on. Then it started walking again. This time, its path was different. It was coming directly towards my tent. I could hear the steps getting closer, louder. The vibrations got stronger. I squeezed my eyes shut like a little kid, thinking if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. It was a stupid primal reaction. It stopped. Right outside. Right outside the thin nylon wall of my tent. I could hear its breathing. It wasn't panting like a dog. It was a low, deep, rhythmic sound, like a bellows. Hoo, shh, hoo, shh. I could smell it too. A smell hit me that I can still recall perfectly. It was a mix of things. Wet dog, but a big wet dog, like after it's been in a swamp. And under that, a foul, musky scent, like rotten meat and old damp earth. It was overwhelming. It filled my tent. I felt a pressure on the side of my tent. Not a push, just a presence. The nylon wall right by my head bulged inward slightly. It was leaning against the tree, my tree, the one with the down-sweeping branches. That's when it made the sound. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a scream. It was a grunt, a deep, guttural, powerful grunt that came from a chest far bigger than any man's. It wasn't just one either, it was a double sound. Hoo-ah, hoo-ah. The sound was so low and resonant, it didn't just go into my ears. It vibrated in my teeth, in my rib cage. It was a sound of pure, raw power. And then the most terrifying part of my entire life happened. From a distance, maybe 250 feet away, down the slope from my camp, another one answered. The response was identical. The exact same double grunt. Hoo-ah, hoo-ah. But it sounded farther away, fainter. They were talking to each other, communicating. The one right outside my tent went silent. The pressure on the tent wall vanished. I didn't hear it move away. It was just gone. The heavy breathing stopped. The smell began to slowly dissipate. The silence came back, but it was a different silence now. It was a waiting silence, a hunted silence. I was no longer an observer. I was prey that had been identified and assessed. My hand was clutching something in my sleeping bag. I hadn't even realized I'd reached for it. It was my Swiss Army knife, the little red one I'd had since I was a boy. I had the biggest blade open, a 2-inch blade that suddenly felt as useful as a toothpick. I was holding it so tight my knuckles ached. I was shaking all over, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. I was cold, so cold. even though I was sweating. I don't know how long I lay there like that, curled in a ball, clutching that stupid little knife, listening to nothing. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been 2 hours. Time lost all meaning. My mind was racing, trying to put a shape to what was out there. A bear. It didn't sound like any bear I'd ever heard on TV. The grunts were wrong. The intelligence behind the circling, the communication. That wasn't a bear. My mind kept skittering away from the only other possibility, the one the old man had almost dared me to find. Then a miracle happened. I heard a bug. A single lone cricket started chirping somewhere off to my left. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Then another joined in, slowly, tentatively. The normal night sounds of the forest started back up. The spell was broken. Whatever had been out there was gone. I didn't sleep another second that night. I stayed in my bag, knife in hand, staring into the blackness, listening to every tiny sound, my body rigid with tension, until the first faint grey light started to filter through the trees. As soon as it was light enough to see, I moved. I unzipped the tent and crawled out, my legs so wobbly I almost fell over. The air was cold and fresh, but the memory of that foul smell was stuck in my nose. I looked around. Nothing. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. Then I looked at the ground near the tree, right where the thing had been standing. The ground was soft there from being sheltered by the branches, and in the dirt, clear as day, was a single footprint. It was massive, longer than my forearm, and wide. It wasn't a bear print. Bears have claws, and this was just the blunt, rounded impression of a foot with 5 toes. The depth of it. It must have weighed an incredible amount. I didn't stick around to examine it. The sight of it filled me with a fresh wave of cold dread. I packed my tent so fast I'm surprised I didn't rip it. I didn't roll it neatly. I just stuffed it into its sack. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even want to look at my food. I just shoved everything into my backpack, not caring about organization, and I started walking, not hiking. Walking with a desperate, frantic speed, back down the trail the way I'd come. I didn't run, but it was a close thing. My back felt exposed the entire way, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something huge moving between the trees. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, down in the parking lot. I threw my gear in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. I just sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to stop shaking. I never went back to that outdoor supply place. I didn't want to see the old man. I didn't want to collect the $50. I didn't want to talk about it. For years, I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't a believer in that kind of stuff before. I thought it was all nonsense for TV shows and weirdos. I don't know what I believe now. I just know what I heard, what I smelled, and what I saw in the dirt the next morning. I know something was out there with me that night. Something big, something smart, and something that knew I was there. And I know that for a few hours in the dark, under a tree in the Olympic Peninsula, I was more scared than I have ever been in my life, before or since. I still get chills thinking about that double grunt and the one that answered it from the dark. Story 7. Okay, I need to get this out. I've been carrying this around for years, and I guess typing it out might help. Or maybe it'll just make me feel crazy all over again. I don't know. But people here seem to get it. So here goes. It was the summer of 1987. Me and my brother Dan, we were on the High Sierra Trail in California, way out in the Kern River Valley. We were both in our 20s then, fit and stupid, thinking we owned the world because we could carry a 40-pound pack for a week. This was our big trip for the year, something we'd been planning since winter. 5 days out in the backcountry, just us, the trail, and the biggest, quietest mountains you've ever seen. The day it happened was our second day on the trail. We'd started at Crescent Meadow, and we were aiming for Hamilton Lakes. The walking was tough, real tough, but the kind of good tired that feels like you've earned your sleep. The air was thin and clean, and the sky was this impossible blue. We'd been goofing off all day, throwing rocks into creeks, arguing about dumb stuff, just being brothers. Dan was ahead of me, his red backpack bobbing along the trail. I remember the smell of pine and dust, and the sound of our boots crunching on the gravel. It was perfect. That's what gets me. It was so damn perfect right up until it wasn't. We found a spot to camp a couple hours before dark. It was a small, flat clearing off the main trail, tucked in near a bend of the Kern River. You could hear the river constantly, this low, steady roar that was just part of the background. We set up the tent, one of those old, heavy canvas things, and got a small fire going. We were cooking up some freeze-dried garbage, laughing about something, probably nothing. The sun was going down, and the light was getting that long golden quality that makes everything look soft and peaceful. The shadows from the trees were stretching out like long, dark fingers across the ground. That's when we heard it. It didn't start slow. It wasn't like a coyote yipping in the distance or an elk bugling. This was different. It cut right through the sound of the river and the fire crackling. It was a scream, but not a human one. And it was a howl, but like nothing I'd ever heard from a wolf. It was both at once, this raw, tearing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was so loud, so close, it felt like it was right inside my head. I froze. A spoonful of beef stroganoff halfway to my mouth, my whole body just locked up. I looked at Dan, and his face had gone completely white. His eyes were huge, fixed on the wall of trees just beyond our little clearing. The sound went on for what felt like a full minute, but it was probably only a few seconds. It was a high-pitched, screaming howl that dropped into this low, guttural roar. It wasn't an animal in pain. It didn't sound scared. It sounded angry and big. You could tell, just from the sheer volume and the depth of it, that whatever was making that noise was massive. The force of it vibrated in my chest. I could feel it in my teeth. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that came after was even worse. It was a heavy, dead silence. The river was still there, but it sounded muffled, far away. There were no crickets, no frogs, nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Neither of us moved. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat. My hand was still holding the spoon, suspended in the air. I slowly lowered it, the metal clinking softly against the mess tin, and the sound was absurdly loud in the quiet. Dan finally looked at me. His voice was a tight whisper. What the hell was that? I just shook my head. I had no words. My mind was racing through possibilities. A mountain lion? No, I've heard them scream. This was different, deeper, more powerful. A bear? Never. Not even close. This was something else, something that didn't fit in any box I had. We both stared into the trees. The shadows were deep now, pitch black between the trunks. Every shape looked like it could be moving. Every pine needle shifting in the slight breeze looked like a lurking form. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it was a physical pressure on the back of my neck. My skin was crawling. I had goosebumps all over my arms, and it wasn't from the cold evening air. Maybe it was farther away than it sounded, Dan said. But his voice was shaky. He didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. We didn't say anything else for a long time. We just sat there listening. The normal night sounds didn't come back. It was just us, the crackle of the fire, and that oppressive waiting silence from the woods. We ate the rest of our food without tasting it. My appetite was gone, replaced by a cold, hard knot in my stomach. When it was time to turn in, we both hesitated. The idea of getting into that flimsy tent, of being zipped into a nylon coffin while that thing was out there, was terrifying. But standing outside felt even more exposed. We should keep the fire going, I muttered. Dan just nodded. We piled on every bit of dead wood we had left near the camp. The fire blazed up, throwing crazy dancing shadows that made me jump more than once. Every snap of a twig in the fire made my heart lurch. We crawled into the tent and zipped the door shut. It felt like the most pathetic defense in the world. We didn't sleep. Not really. We lay there in our sleeping bags, in the dark, listening. The fabric of the tent was so thin. I remember staring up at the mesh roof, at the few stars I could see, and feeling utterly, completely vulnerable. Every little noise from outside, the rustle of a mouse, the sigh of the wind, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. I was gripping my hunting knife so tight, my hand hurt. It was a stupid, useless gesture, but it was all I had. I kept replaying the sound in my head, that screaming howl. It was imprinted on my brain. It was a sound of pure, primitive dominance. It wasn't asking for anything. It was announcing its presence, and it felt like a threat. A couple of times I thought I heard something big moving around outside, a heavy shuffling step that crunched the gravel, but the sound of the river made it hard to be sure. Was that a branch breaking, or just the river pushing a rock? The not knowing was its own special kind of torture. My imagination was filling in every blank with the worst possible thing. I pictured something huge and dark, covered in hair, standing just at the edge of the firelight, watching our tent. Dan was breathing heavily next to me, but I could tell he was awake too. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We were just two guys, trapped in a tiny tent, hoping the sun would come up. The night lasted forever. When the first hint of grey light finally started to seep through the tent fabric, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We didn't wait for sunrise. The moment we could see well enough to pack, we were up. We moved fast, a frantic, silent efficiency. We didn't talk about what we'd heard. We just packed the tent, stomped out the ashes of the fire, and got the hell out of there. We didn't even make coffee. We just started walking, eating granola bars as we went. The whole hike out that day was tense. We were jumpy, looking over our shoulders constantly. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like it had eyes. Every large tree or rock formation looked like a potential hiding place. The memory of that sound was a ghost walking right behind us. We cut our trip short. Instead of going all the way to Mount Whitney, we bailed out at the first trailhead we could reach that led to a road. We hitched a ride into the nearest town, which was just a tiny little place with a general store and a payphone. We were dirty, tired, and still shaken. We went into the general store to get some real food, something that wasn't dehydrated, and that's when we saw it. Tacked up on a bulletin board near the door, mixed in with notices for lost dogs and community potlucks, was a small handwritten flyer. It was a notice about a sighting, a Bigfoot sighting. My blood ran cold. I remember the feeling, a sudden drop in my stomach like I'd missed a step. Dan saw it at the same time I did. We both moved closer, not saying a word. The flyer was simple. It said that a hiker had reported seeing a large, bipedal, hairy creature in the Kern River Valley area. The description was vague, tall, dark hair, but the date listed for the sighting was the same day we'd heard the scream, the exact same day. I felt the air go out of me. It was like a punch to the gut. Dan looked at me, and his face was a mirror of what I was feeling. It was a mix of "I told you so" and pure, undiluted horror. We'd written it off. We'd spent the whole next day trying to convince ourselves it was a weird echo, a strange bear, anything but what our gut was telling us. We'd joked about it, in that nervous way you do when you're trying to pretend you're not scared. But seeing that date on the paper, in someone else's handwriting, it made it real. It connected our experience to something tangible. We hadn't just heard a strange noise. We had heard it. The thing people make jokes about, the thing you see in cheesy movies. We bought our snacks and got out of there. The ride home was quiet. We didn't talk about it much. Not then, not for a long time. It was too big, too weird. What were we supposed to say? Hey, remember that time we almost got eaten by Bigfoot? It sounds insane, but I've never forgotten it, not for a single day. The memory of that sound is as clear now as it was 36 years ago. I can still feel the way my heart stopped. I can still feel that primal fear, the kind that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your spine. It's the feeling of being prey, of being small and soft in a world where something that much bigger and stronger knows exactly where you are. We never went back to that part of the High Sierra Trail. Dan and I still go backpacking, but we stick to more popular areas now. We never camp in small, isolated clearings, and we always listen to the silence. Because sometimes the silence is the most terrifying sound of all. That's it. That's what happened. I still don't know what it was, but I know what we heard, and I know what that flyer said. And sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and just lie there listening, and for a second I can almost hear it again. Story 8. The summer I turned 12, I spent the whole of July and August at my grandparents' place. It wasn't a farm, really, more of a big old ranch house on a decent chunk of land just outside of Howinson. The kind of place where the trees start to get thick at the edge of the property and just keep going, deeper and darker, for what felt like forever to a kid from the suburbs. That particular evening is burned into my brain. It was one of those hot, sticky summer days where the air feels thick enough to chew. The light was just starting to go golden, the way it does before it gives up and lets the night take over. My grandfather was out on the porch, cleaning his rifle, a thing he did with a quiet, methodical focus that I always found fascinating. I was sitting on the steps, swatting at mosquitoes and smelling the mix of gun oil and warm pine. The quiet got broken by my grandmother's voice from inside the screen door. "The bay mare hasn't come up," she said. She didn't sound panicked, just stating a fact. The horses usually wandered up from the lower pasture around this time for their evening feed. The bay mare was the oldest, the one I'd learned to ride on. She was gentle and predictable. Her not being there was wrong. My grandfather didn't say anything. He just finished putting his rifle back together, the clicks and snaps of it sounding final in the quiet air. He stood up, his knees cracking, a sound I'd gotten used to. "Come on," he said to me, his voice low. "We'll take a look." I remember the feeling in my gut then. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more a low thrum of importance. My grandfather didn't often ask me to come along for serious things. This was a job. I followed him off the porch, and we started down the worn dirt path that led into the lower pasture. The air changed as we left the cleared yard. It got cooler under the canopy of the first line of trees, but heavier too. It smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. The buzzing of the insects was louder here, a constant vibrating hum that felt like it was coming from inside my own head. We walked for maybe 15-20 minutes, calling for the horse now and then. My grandfather's voice was a short, sharp bark that didn't travel far in the thick air. My own call sounded thin and reedy in comparison. We found her in a small clearing where the creek bent. She wasn't standing. She was on her side, and even from a distance I could see the shape was all wrong. We got closer, and the smell hit me first. It was a sweet, coppery, rotten smell that made the back of my throat tighten. Flies rose in a black cloud as we approached. The horse was dead. That much was obvious, but she wasn't just dead. A huge part of her side was just gone, ripped open. The ribs were exposed, white and stark against the dark red and purple of everything else. Her insides were a mess, torn out and scattered around her. The ground was churned up and dark with blood. It wasn't a clean kill, it was a violent, messy ripping apart. I stood there, frozen, my stomach doing flip-flops. I'd seen dead animals before, rabbits the dogs had caught, a deer my grandfather had brought back from a hunt. But nothing like this. This was different. This was butchery. My grandfather didn't say a word. He just stood there, his jaw tight, looking down at the horse. He wasn't looking at it with sadness, not really. It was something else. His eyes were scanning the trees around the clearing, moving slowly, carefully. He looked tense, like a wire pulled too tight. "Wolves," he muttered, more to himself than to me, or a pack of coyotes got brave. but even at 12, I could hear the doubt in his voice. It didn't look like a pack had done this. The damage was too concentrated, too brutal. It looked like something had just taken huge, savage bites out of her. He finally turned away from the carcass. "Nothing to be done," he said, his voice flat. "Come on, let's get back. It'll be dark soon." The walk back felt different. The woods, which had just been woods before, now felt like they were watching us. Every little snap of a twig made me jump. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, darker. The golden light was almost gone, replaced by a deep, gloomy blue. My grandfather was walking faster now, and I had to practically jog to keep up with his long strides. He wasn't looking at me. His head was on a swivel, constantly scanning our surroundings. We were about halfway back, maybe a little more, following the path along the creek. The sound of the water should have been calming, but it just felt like it was covering up other sounds. I was focused on the ground, trying not to trip on a root in the fading light, when my grandfather suddenly stopped dead. I almost ran into his back. He threw his arm out hard, catching me in the chest and stopping me. It wasn't a gentle stop. It was a jolt. "Don't move," he whispered. His voice was so low and tight it was almost a hiss. My heart, which had already been thumping, just seized up. I followed his gaze. He was staring off into the trees to our left, across the creek. At first I couldn't see anything, just more trees, more shadows. The light was bad, the deep blue of twilight making everything blend together. Then I saw it. It was standing maybe 40, 50 feet away, partly hidden by the trunk of a big pine tree. It was tall, so much taller than a man, and it was dark, a deep, shadowy brown color that was almost black in the dim light. It had hair, long, shaggy hair that hung off its body. But its arms were wrong. They were way too long, hanging down past its knees. They were thick, powerful looking, and they didn't move like a man's arms. They made me think of an orangutan I'd seen at the zoo once, just that same kind of heavy, dangling proportion. It was perfectly still, and it was looking right at us. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could see its eyes. They caught the last little bit of light in the sky and reflected it back, 2 points of pale, greenish-yellow light, just like a cat's eyes do in the headlights of a car. That's the part that really got to me, that made my blood run cold. Those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, not exactly, and they weren't human. They were just intelligent, and they were fixed on us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even blink. I was just frozen, staring at this thing staring back at us. The woods had gone completely silent. The insects had stopped buzzing. The birds were gone. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. My grandfather moved slowly, so slowly. He started to raise his rifle. It was the old lever-action 30-30 he always carried. I heard the soft, leathery creak of his jacket as he brought the stock to his shoulder. The metal of the rifle gleamed dully. The moment the rifle came up, the thing reacted. It didn't run. It didn't make a sound. It just moved. Its head tilted just a fraction, and then one of those impossibly long arms snapped out. It grabbed a branch from the pine tree it was standing near. This wasn't a small twig. This was a solid branch, maybe as thick as my own 12-year-old leg, and it shook it. It wasn't a testing shake. It was a violent, powerful, aggressive jerk. The whole tree seemed to shudder. There was a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the silent woods, a sound like a gunshot. The branch, a good 6-foot-long piece of wood, just snapped off in its hand. The speed of it all was what stunned me. 1 second it was still. The next it had shattered a tree branch with what looked like effortless strength. It didn't even seem to put its body into it. It was just the raw power in that arm. Then it moved. It dropped the branch and turned, melting back into the trees, but it didn't turn its back on us. It moved sideways, in a kind of crouching, crab-like gait, keeping its front and those horrible glowing eyes pointed in our direction the whole time. It was unbelievably fast. It didn't run so much as it flowed, its long arms sometimes touching the ground. propelling it forward with a speed that was just wrong. It was too fast for something that big. It moved through the thick undergrowth like it wasn't even there, silent and fluid, and in maybe 3 or 4 seconds it was just gone, vanished into the deep shadows of the forest. The silence it left behind was heavier than before. Then the forest sounds slowly trickled back in. A cricket, the creek. But they sounded distant and thin. My grandfather slowly lowered the rifle. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't even had time to chamber a round. He just stood there, staring into the empty space where the thing had been. I could see his profile. His face was pale, and his mouth was a hard, thin line. He looked old. I'd never seen him look old before. He finally turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, and in them I saw a kind of fear I didn't know my grandfather was capable of feeling. He was a rock, a steady, unshakable presence in my life. And in that moment, he looked shaken to his core. He put a hand on my shoulder. His hand was trembling. I could feel the fine vibration through my shirt. "We don't talk about this," he said, his voice rough and quiet. "Not to your grandmother, not to anyone. You understand me? They'll say we're crazy. They'll laugh. You don't ever talk about what we saw here." I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The walk back to the house was the longest of my life. Every shadow was that thing. Every rustle of leaves was it coming back. I stayed glued to my grandfather's side, my heart hammering against my ribs the whole way. He didn't say another word. When we got to the porch, the warm yellow light from the kitchen window felt like a lie. The world wasn't safe and normal anymore. It had something in it that wasn't supposed to be there. We never found the horse's body. My grandfather and a couple of his friends went out the next day with a tractor to bury it. But they came back, saying they couldn't find it. Just a big, dark stain on the ground and a lot of tracks they couldn't identify. They said a bear must have dragged it off. My grandfather didn't argue. He just nodded and let them think it. He never took me back into those woods again, and he never, ever spoke of that evening. Not once, for all the years I knew him after that. Sometimes I'd catch him looking out the window towards the tree line, his face grim and thoughtful. And I knew he was remembering it too, remembering the size of it, the silence, the way it moved, and those cold, glowing eyes that watched us from the dark. He died a few years ago, and he took whatever he really thought about that day with him. I'm a grown man now. I have a family, a job, a normal life, but I've never forgotten. I still dream about it sometimes. I'll be back in those woods. The light is fading, and I'll see it standing there, perfectly still, and I'll hear that sharp, shattering crack of the branch, a sound that wasn't just wood breaking, but was something else, something challenging and ancient and terrifying, a sound that told us we were not the top of the food chain out there. We were just visitors, and we were being watched. Story 9. So I'm just gonna type this out because I need to get it off my chest. And honestly, I don't know where else to put it. I've been sitting on this for a while now, and every time I think about it, my hands still get a little shaky. I was visiting my friend's farm near Portland, Tennessee. This was back in early October a few years ago. The leaves were starting to turn, and the air had that crisp feel that makes you want to be outside. I'd driven out there to help him get ready for a campout he was planning with some family friends. Nothing fancy, just a weekend thing in the woods behind his property. I've been to that farm loads of times. It's a peaceful place, or at least it always was before that day. I got there in the morning, around 9 o'clock. The sun was up, but it was still kind of cool, and the sky was clear blue. My friend was already out by the barn, stacking firewood. He waved me over, and we started talking about where we'd set up the campsite. His dog, a big mutt named Rex, mostly German Shepherd, I think, was bouncing around like always, tail wagging and ready to go. Rex is usually pretty obedient, listens to commands without much fuss, so when we decided to head into the woods to scout a spot, we brought him along, figured he'd enjoy the run. The woods behind the farm are dense, mostly oaks and pines, with a narrow path that weaves through them. We've walked it plenty of times, so it felt familiar. At first, everything was normal. The ground was soft underfoot from recent rain, and you could smell that damp earth mixed with pine needles. Rex was trotting ahead of us, sniffing at bushes and chasing squirrels, but after maybe 20 minutes, he started acting off. He'd stop dead in his tracks, ears perked up, and just stare into the trees. My friend called him back a couple of times, and Rex would usually come, but this time he ignored us. He'd let out this low growl, then bolt ahead like he was chasing something, but there was nothing there that we could see. We kept walking, thinking he'd just caught a scent or something, but then he ran toward this open field that borders the woods. It's not a big field, maybe an acre or two, mostly overgrown with tall grass and a few scattered trees. Rex was barking like crazy, and when we caught up to him, we saw why. There were these trees, 3 or 4 of them, with the bark stripped off in long, ragged strips. Not like deer rubbing against them. This looked like something had torn it away with force. The branches above were snapped clean off too, some of them lying on the ground like they'd been broken by hand. The whole area felt wrong, like the air was heavier there. My friend, he's usually pretty laid back, but his face went pale. He pulled out his pocket knife and carved a mark into one of the trees, just a quick X, and said we needed to go back and get his dad. His voice was tight, and he kept glancing around like he expected something to jump out at us. I didn't argue. The way Rex was acting, whining and pacing, not even responding to his name, made my skin crawl. We turned around and headed back toward the farm, and Rex followed us, but he kept looking over his shoulder like he was watching something we couldn't see. The walk back felt twice as long. Every little sound, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was probably just a bear or something, but deep down, I knew bears don't strip trees like that. Not in this area. When we got to the barn, my friend went inside to find his dad, and I stayed outside with Rex. The barn is old, red paint peeling off, and it smells like hay and motor oil. I leaned against the door, trying to calm down, but my heart was still racing. Rex was panting, his tongue hanging out, and he seemed a little calmer now that we were back in the open. After a few minutes, I figured I'd let him out to run around the yard while we waited. I unhooked his leash, and he trotted off toward a small pond near the edge of the property. It's not much, just a muddy pond where the cows sometimes drink, but Rex loves it because he can splash around. I was watching him, half distracted, when he suddenly started barking again. This fierce, aggressive bark that I'd never heard from him before. It wasn't his usual, "Hey, there's a squirrel" bark. It was deeper, more frantic. I turned to look, and that's when I saw it. Over by the electric fence, maybe 100 feet away, there was this massive figure standing next to some tobacco trailers. I froze. My brain couldn't process it at first. It was huge, like way bigger than any person I've ever seen. It had to be over 7 feet tall, with shoulders that were broad and muscular, covered in thick red-brown hair that looked matted and dirty. Its face was gorilla-like, with a heavy brow and a flat nose, and it was just standing there, sniffing the air. The whole thing was so out of place, so wrong, that for a second I thought I was hallucinating. Rex was barking non-stop, lunging toward it but keeping his distance, like he was scared too. The creature, I don't even know what to call it, grunted, this low, guttural sound that vibrated in my chest. I dropped to the ground without thinking, my knees giving way. I crouched behind a stack of hay bales, peeking out, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were sweating, and I was trembling all over. I remember the smell of wet grass and my own fear, sharp and metallic. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It moved its head slowly, like it was scanning the area, and then it took a step toward the pond. Rex kept barking, and the creature grunted again, almost like it was annoyed. Then, in a blink, it turned and ran into the woods on the other side of the field. It moved fast, way faster than anything that big should be able to move, just a blur of muscle and hair disappearing into the trees. I stayed on the ground for what felt like forever, but it was probably only a minute or two. My legs were weak, and I had to force myself to stand up. Rex had stopped barking and was now whining, pacing back and forth by the pond. I called him over, and he came, but he kept looking toward the woods where the thing had gone. A few minutes later, my friend and his dad came out of the house. His dad had a shotgun slung over his shoulder, and his face was grim. He walked straight up to me and asked, "Did you see it?" His voice was low and serious. I just nodded, too shaken to speak. He looked toward the woods, then back at me and said we should check the area. We went over to where I'd seen the creature, near the tobacco trailers. The ground was soft from the rain, and there were footprints, huge, deep impressions that were larger than his dad's boot. His dad is a big guy, wears a size 12, and these prints were easily a couple inches longer and wider. They looked human-like, but not quite, with a splayed shape that made the hair on my arms stand up. His dad knelt down, tracing one of the prints with his finger, and muttered something about cows being attacked on neighboring farms over the past few weeks. He didn't elaborate, just shook his head and told us not to tell his wife about any of this, said she'd worry too much. Then he stood up, shouldered the shotgun, and walked back toward the house, leaving me there with my friend and Rex. We didn't talk much after that. My friend helped me pack up my stuff, and I drove home in a daze. The whole way I kept replaying it in my head, the way it stood, the sound of its grunt, the sheer size of it. I've spent years trying to rationalize it, telling myself it was a bear or some kind of prank, but I know what I saw. And those footprints, they weren't from any animal I've ever heard of. To this day, I can't explain it. And every time I go out into the woods, I get this uneasy feeling, like I'm being watched. I never went back to that farm, and my friend and I don't talk about it much, but when we do, he gets quiet. And I know he's thinking the same thing I am. Whatever that was, it was real, and it was close, too close. Story 10. Okay, I'll try to write this out like it just happened to me. I'm still shaky thinking about it, even now. I don't tell this to many people because it sounds crazy, but something happened a few years back at a family camp in Adams County, Ohio, that I still can't explain. I've turned it over in my head 1,000 times, and the only thing that makes any sense is the one thing I never believed in before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was the middle of August, one of those thick, humid Ohio summers where the air feels like a wet blanket the second you step outside. My son was about 10 at the time, and I'd promised him a camping trip before school started back up. My buddy, let's just call him Mark, he brought his boy, who was the same age, and another kid from the neighborhood, a quiet boy named Leo. We picked this family-oriented campground in Adams County because it was supposed to be safe, well-maintained, with a small lake for fishing and plenty of woods for the kids to explore without getting lost. It was nestled in this valley, surrounded by heavy, old forest. The kind of woods that feel ancient, you know? Not like a city park. This was the real thing. We got there around noon on a Saturday. The sun was high and bright, but under the canopy of trees, it was all shadows and dappled light. We set up our tents near our van, a beat-up old Dodge Caravan that we'd packed to the roof with gear. The kids were buzzing with energy, running around between the trees, while Mark and I got the fire pit ready and set up the tents. Everything was normal. It felt good. The smell of pine needles and damp earth, the sound of the kids laughing. It was a perfect summer day. The first thing that was off, and I didn't think much of it at the time, happened in the afternoon. The three boys had been playing a game, some kind of tag, darting in and out of the tree line about 50 yards from our site. They came running back, all out of breath, their faces a little flushed. My son, he's usually a pretty brave kid, but he looked spooked. "Dad, we saw something," he said, his voice a little too high. "I figured it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. What was it, buddy? A squirrel big enough to carry you off?" He didn't laugh. No, it had yellow eyes. Mark's boy chimed in, nodding vigorously. "Yeah, yellow eyes. It was behind a big tree." Leo, the quiet one, just stood there, his eyes wide, not saying anything. Mark and I exchanged a look. We're both dads. You hear this stuff? Kids have big imaginations, especially in the woods. Probably just an owl, Mark said, ruffling his son's hair, or the sun playing tricks. We walked over to where they pointed, a thicket of oaks and underbrush. We looked around. Nothing. No movement, no sound except for the usual forest noises. No broken branches, no tracks that I could see. The ground was a mess of leaves and roots. I remember feeling the prickle of sweat on my neck, but I wrote it off as the heat. We told the kids it was nothing, probably a trick of the light, and to stay a little closer to camp. They seemed to accept it, the moment passing, and soon they were back to playing, though they didn't go quite as far into the woods after that. The rest of the day was fine. We grilled burgers, the kids ate until they were stuffed, and we told stories around the campfire until the sky turned from orange to deep purple. The fire crackled and spit embers into the dark, and the woods around us became a solid wall of blackness. You know how it gets in the deep woods at night. The circle of light from your fire feels very, very small. We decided on the sleeping arrangements. Mark and the 3 boys would take the bigger tent, and I'd take the smaller 2-person tent right next to the van. It was cozy. I remember zipping myself in, the sound of the zipper loud in the quiet. I could hear the boys whispering and giggling in the other tent for a while before they finally settled down. Mark snored, a low, steady rumble. The sounds were comforting. Normal. I fell asleep pretty quickly, tired from the drive and the fresh air. What woke me up wasn't a sound at first. It was a feeling, a pressure change, like the air itself had gotten heavier. I opened my eyes to absolute blackness. The inside of the tent was pitch black. My watch had a little light on it, and when I clicked it, it glowed just enough to see the time. It was a little after 3 in the morning. That's when I heard it. A grunt. It wasn't an animal grunt I recognized. It wasn't a deer snorting or a bear huffing. This was deeper, lower. It came from my right, from the woods just beyond the edge of our clearing. I held my breath, my whole body going rigid inside my sleeping bag. My heart was suddenly hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought it might crack one. The grunt came again. It was closer. It sounded wet, guttural, like it came from a chest bigger than any man's. It wasn't loud, but it carried. It vibrated in the ground. I could feel it through the floor of the tent. I lay there, frozen, listening. The snoring from the other tent had stopped. Either Mark had woken up, or he'd rolled over. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, heavy. Not the light, quick steps of a deer. This was a thump, drag, thump, drag. Each step was deliberate. It was walking, and it was getting closer. I tried to tell myself it was just a person, maybe another camper sleepwalking, but my gut knew that was a lie. No person walks with that kind of weight. Each footfall made a soft, crushing sound on the forest floor, like it was stepping on and breaking small branches without even trying. Thump. Drag. It was 10, maybe 15 feet away from my tent, just outside the ring of where our fire had been. I could picture it in my head, a huge, dark shape moving between the trees. I didn't want to picture it. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that made it worse. My ears were straining, picking up every tiny sound. The rasp of my own breathing sounded deafening. Then it bumped the van. It wasn't a hard bump. It was a soft, solid thud, like someone had leaned a heavy shoulder against the side of the vehicle. The van rocked slightly on its springs. A cold terror, pure and sharp, shot down my spine. This thing was right there. It was between my tent and the van. I was trapped. My mind was screaming at me to move, to grab my knife, to yell for Mark, but my body was locked in place. Every instinct I had was telling me to be silent, to be small, to play dead. It was the most primal fear I've ever felt. I wasn't a dad. I wasn't a man. I was just prey hiding in a thin nylon shell. I heard it take another step, then another. It was right next to my tent now. I could hear its breathing, a low, rhythmic puffing sound. The side of my tent, the nylon wall, bulged inward slightly. Something brushed against it. It wasn't a hard touch. It was a slow, deliberate drag against the fabric, from the top of the tent down to the ground. It felt hairy, coarse. I could hear the individual strands scraping against the nylon. A smell hit me then, a smell that I can still recall perfectly. It was a mix of things, wet dog, but stronger, and something else underneath, something foul and musky like old rot and dirt. It was so potent it made my eyes water. I pressed my face into my sleeping bag to keep from gagging. Then the sniffing started, right outside my head, a loud, wet sniffing sound. Sniff, sniff, sniff. It was inhaling, deep and long, like it was trying to smell me through the tent. It was so close I could feel the heat of its breath, a warm, damp wave that came through the fabric. I could hear the air moving in and out of its nostrils. I curled into a ball, pulling my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. I remember a single clear thought, cutting through the panic. Don't move, don't make a sound. It knows you're here, but if you're quiet, it might think you're not a threat, it might leave. The sniffing stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. The absence of sound was almost worse. Was it waiting? Was it just on the other side of this thin piece of nylon, listening for me? I could feel the weight of its presence, a physical pressure in the air. I was trembling uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. I clenched my jaw to stop them. Then I heard it take a step, away from the tent. Thump, drag. Another step. It was moving slowly, heading back towards the tree line. The footsteps got quieter, the heavy thuds becoming more muffled by the distance. The foul smell began to fade. I didn't move. I didn't uncurl from my ball. I just lay there, listening as the footsteps receded into the woods until I couldn't hear them at all. The forest sounds didn't come back right away. It was dead silent for a long time. Then, tentatively, a cricket started chirping. Then another. The normal night slowly returned, but I didn't. I stayed like that, rigid and terrified, until the first hints of grey dawn light started to filter through the green fabric of the tent. When it was fully light out, I finally unzipped my tent and crawled out. My legs were so weak I almost fell over. The air was clean and cool. I looked around. Everything looked normal. The van was there. The other tent was quiet. But then I looked at the ground next to my tent. There was a patch of dirt where the grass was scuffed away, and pressed into the soft soil was a single footprint. It was huge, longer than my forearm and twice as wide. It wasn't a bear print. It was vaguely human-shaped, but massive, with 5 clear toe impressions. I just stared at it, my blood running cold. I didn't say anything to Mark or the kids when they woke up. I just started packing, my hands shaking as I folded the tent. The kids were cheerful, asking about pancakes, completely oblivious. Mark gave me a weird look, but didn't press it. We left that morning. I made up some excuse about checking the weather and seeing storms coming. I didn't mention the grunts, the footsteps, the smell, or the print. I didn't want to scare the kids. I didn't want to sound insane. It wasn't until months later I was flipping through channels late one night, half asleep, and I landed on one of those shows about cryptids. They were talking about Bigfoot encounters in Ohio, in Adams County. They described the sounds, the smell, the behavior, and it was like they were reading from my memory. That's when the pieces clicked into place, and a whole new kind of chill went through me. It wasn't just some weird one-off animal. Other people had heard it, smelled it, felt that same soul-crushing fear. I've talked to Mark about it since. We're planning to go back, not to camp, but with a couple other guys who are into this stuff. We want to go during the day with cameras and recording equipment and see if we can find any evidence in that heavily forested area. I have to know. I have to try and understand what was outside my tent that night, sniffing at me in the dark, something that walked on 2 legs and was big enough to shake a van with a nudge. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up for no reason and I'll just lie there in the silence of my own house, and I'll remember that low, deep grunt and the way the tent fabric moved and that god-awful smell. And I know, with a certainty that sits like a stone in my gut, that we weren't alone out there. Something was watching us, something knew we were there, and I still don't know what it was. Story 11. I've always been an early riser, even in retirement. That day I got up around 6 in the morning, made some coffee, and just stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the backyard. Our house backs up to a thick patch of woods. Nothing unusual for this area. Lots of deer, raccoons, the usual wildlife. But that morning, something caught my eye. There were tracks in the snow, starting from the tree line and heading straight toward the house. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a person, but the more I looked, the weirder it got. I pulled on my boots and a heavy coat, grabbed my gloves and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall, the kind that makes your lungs ache if you breathe too deep. The snow was deep, maybe 10 inches, and crunched under my feet. I walked over to where the tracks began, right at the edge of the woods. They were bipedal, like something walking on 2 legs, but the stride was huge, I mean really long. Each step was about 5 feet apart, and they were perfectly even. No wobble or side-to-side stagger like you'd see with a person. It was like whatever made them was moving in a straight line purposefully. I knelt down to get a closer look. The footprints themselves were bizarre. They were big, maybe 15 inches long, with these wide, splayed toes that fanned out at the front. The toes weren't like any animal I'd ever seen. No claws, just these blunt, rounded impressions. And the way they sank into the snow was odd too. They punched straight down, vertically, like whatever made them was heavy and just dropped its weight straight down with each step. There was no sliding or dragging, no signs of hesitation. It was clean, almost mechanical, but not quite. My wife came out a few minutes later, wrapped in her robe and looking concerned. She asked what I was doing, and I just pointed at the tracks. She's not easily spooked, but her eyes got wide when she saw them. We've lived here for over 20 years, and we've seen all kinds of animal tracks, but nothing like this. Our son, who was visiting for the weekend, heard us talking and came out too. He's in his 20s, fit and tall, and he's always been skeptical about stuff like this. But when he saw the tracks, even he looked uneasy. We decided to follow them. The tracks led from the woods, across our backyard, and then along the side of the house. They went right up to the windows. First our living room window, then the kitchen window. Like whatever it was had been peering inside. I felt a chill run down my spine at that thought. We checked the snow around the windows, and there were no signs of it trying to get in, no scratches or anything. Just those deep, vertical footprints where it had stood, and I assume looked in. My son tried to match the stride. He's about 6 feet tall, and he took big, lunging steps, but he couldn't even come close to covering the distance between the prints. He'd jump or stretch, but he'd always fall short by a foot or more. And when he tried to walk in a straight line, like the tracks, he'd wobble or leave uneven marks. These tracks were perfectly aligned, like they were made by something with incredible balance and strength. He gave up after a few tries, shaking his head and saying, "This isn't right, Dad." We followed the tracks further, and they led to our neighbors' houses too. We didn't go onto their properties, but from the street we could see the same pattern. Tracks coming out of the woods, going up to windows, and then heading back. It was like this thing had done a loop, checking out multiple homes before returning to the forest. I remember standing there, my breath fogging in the cold air, and feeling this deep, gut-level fear. This wasn't some random animal. It was methodical, almost intelligent. Back at our house, I got down on my hands and knees to examine one of the footprints more closely. The snow was packed firm where it had stepped, and the edges were sharp, not blurred like they'd been made by something stumbling or sliding. The splayed toes were the weirdest part. Each toe impression was distinct, almost like a hand with fingers, but not quite. There was no arch like in a human foot. It was flat with the toes spread wide, as if for balance. I took some photos with my old digital camera, but back then the quality wasn't great, and in the snow everything looked washed out. The rest of that day I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see something in the woods. The trees were dark and thick, and with the snow covering everything, it was like a monochrome world where anything could be hiding. My wife was on edge too. She kept checking the locks on the doors and windows, something she never does. Our son tried to lighten the mood, joking about Bigfoot or something, but his laughter sounded forced, and he kept glancing toward the woods. I'm a practical guy. I spent my career solving problems, figuring out how things work. But this? There was no logic to it. I thought about all the possible explanations. Could it be a bear? Bears don't walk on two legs for that long, and their tracks are different, more rounded with claws, a person in some kind of suit. But the stride was too long, and the footprints didn't match any boot I've ever seen. Plus, who would be out in the middle of a snowstorm, walking in a perfect line to peer into windows? It didn't add up. As the day wore on, the fear settled into a low hum in the back of my mind. I kept going outside to look at the tracks, almost obsessively. The sun came out around noon, casting long shadows, and the snow started to melt a bit, but the tracks were still clear. I measured them with a tape measure. The stride was consistently 4.5 to 5 feet, and the footprints were 14 inches long and 8 inches wide. The toes were about 3 inches long each, splayed out in a way that made me think of something primitive, but the precision of the steps felt anything but. By late afternoon I was exhausted, but I couldn't relax. My wife made lunch, but neither of us ate much. We just sat at the table, staring out the window. The tracks were still there, a silent reminder that something had been right outside our home. I thought about calling the police or someone, but what would I say? There are weird footprints in the snow? They'd probably think I was crazy. Plus, I had no evidence of any crime, just this eerie, unsettling feeling. As dusk fell, the temperature dropped again, and the snow refroze, making the tracks even more defined. I remember standing by the back door, looking out at the woods and feeling a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the kind of fear that sits in your bones, the kind that makes you question everything you think you know. I've never been one for superstition or paranormal stuff, but in that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something out there that science hasn't explained yet. My son left to go back to his place around 7 that evening, and after he drove off, the house felt emptier. My wife and I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the wind howl outside, and every creak of the house made me jump. At one point, I got up and looked out the bedroom window. The moon was out, casting a pale light on the snow, and I could still see the tracks leading away into the darkness. It was then that the full weight of it hit me. Whatever made those tracks was intelligent enough to avoid being seen, strong enough to move through deep snow with ease, and curious enough to look into our homes, and it was still out there in those woods. The next day, the snow started to melt faster, and within a couple of days, the tracks were gone. But the memory stuck with me. About a week later, I was outside late at night taking out the trash, and I heard this distant wail. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not a coyote, not a bear, but something deep and guttural, almost like those Bigfoot recordings you hear about. It sent chills down my spine, and I rushed back inside. Then a few months after that, I was driving near a marsh on the edge of the county, and I saw this impenetrable black shape moving through the trees. It was tall and bulky, and it vanished before I could get a better look. The next day, I went back, and there was nothing, no tracks, no signs. But that first day with the tracks in the snow was when the terror really set in. It's been years now, and I still think about it. I have no concrete evidence, no photos that prove anything, just this gut feeling that something unknown was prowling our neighborhood that day. Something intelligent, something that knew what it was doing. And that realization that we might not be alone, even here in Ohio, still sends chills down my spine whenever I look out at those woods. Story 12. Okay, I'll try to write this. I'm still kind of shaky thinking about it even now. I don't know what we saw, but I know it wasn't an animal, not any animal I've ever seen or heard of. It was Thursday, July 23rd. I remember the date because it's my buddy's birthday, and we'd just left his place after having a couple of beers. It wasn't a wild night or anything, just a few of us hanging out. There was me, my older brother, and two of our friends. One was driving his SUV. It was a clear night, not too cold for the mountains, and we were just driving, the way you do when you're bored and there's nowhere else to be. The plan was just to cruise the mountain loop highway for a bit, maybe see some stars away from the city lights. I was the one who suggested the specific spot. See, a few days before, on Monday, I'd been up that way by myself, just clearing my head. And I heard something. It was late. The sun had been down for an hour or so, and I was parked at this little pull-off that overlooks a steep, wooded valley. I was just sitting there, listening to the quiet, when I heard this sound. It wasn't a coyote. I've heard coyotes. It wasn't an owl or an elk bugle. This was different. It was a whoop, a deep, guttural whoop that echoed through the trees, followed by another one, a little higher in pitch from a different direction. It didn't sound friendly. It sounded like a conversation, but a conversation between things that were big. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. It was one of those noises that just feels wrong in your bones. I got out of there pretty quick after that, didn't tell many people, because, you know, who's gonna believe you? But tonight, with my brother and my friends, I felt safe enough to bring it up. We were driving, the headlights cutting a tunnel through the absolute blackness of the forest, and I just mentioned it. Hey, you guys ever hear anything weird up here? And I told them about the whoops. My brother, he's a skeptic about everything. Thinks Bigfoot is a joke. Ghosts aren't real, all that. He just laughed and said, I probably heard a bear with a sore throat. We were all joking around about it, the driver saying maybe it was a Sasquatch trying to get a date. It was all light-hearted. We pulled into that same exact pull-off I'd been at on Monday. The driver killed the engine, and we just sat there in the dark. The silence up there is heavy. It's not like the quiet in your neighborhood. It's a thick, pressing silence where you can hear your own heartbeat. We were talking in low voices, just shooting the breeze, and I was pointing out into the darkness where I thought the sounds had come from. I was trying to describe it again, the way the sound seemed to carry, how it didn't fade like a normal sound would, but just sort of hung in the air. That's when my brother stopped laughing. He was in the front passenger seat, and he just went completely still. His face in the dim light from the dashboard went slack. His eyes were locked on something out my window, which was the side of the car facing the valley. Don't move, he said, and his voice was a low, tight whisper. It was the kind of voice you use when you see a cop car behind you. All the joking was gone. What? I said, my own voice sounding too loud. What is it? Eyes, he breathed out. He didn't even look at me. He was just staring, frozen. There are eyes out there. We all turned to look. At first I didn't see anything, just blackness. The kind of dark your eyes can't really adjust to because there's no light source at all. It was like staring into a pit. Then I saw it. A pair of tiny, bright orange dots reflecting the faint residual light from our dashboard. They were high up, too high. If it was a deer, it would have to be standing on its hind legs on the slope below us. And even then, it seemed too tall. The eyes weren't moving. They were just fixed on us. Then the driver, his voice shaky, said, "Oh, shit." He was looking further down the slope. There's another pair. And then, like a nightmare coming into focus, we all started seeing them, one after another. Pairs of glowing, fiery orange eyes, all at the same impossible height, all completely motionless, just watching us from the absolute black of the woods. My brother started counting them under his breath, his finger subtly pointing as he did. 6, 7, 8. Jesus, at least 8. 8 pairs of eyes, at least. They were spread out in a rough semicircle surrounding the pull-off on the valley side. They weren't close together like a pack of wolves would be. They were spaced apart, like they were stationed, like they had taken up positions. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard, I felt dizzy. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't a bunch of raccoons looking for food. This was a perimeter, a silent, watching perimeter. The air in the car went from relaxed to thick, with a terror so sharp I could taste it, like metal on my tongue. The guy in the back seat with me, one of our friends, started to make this low, whimpering sound. He wasn't a nervous guy normally, but this was different. This was a primal fear, the kind that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your spine. He was breathing in short, ragged gasps. "What are they?" he kept whispering over and over. "What are they?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We just sat there, trapped in this little box of light, being stared down by something we couldn't see in the darkness. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't waver. They were just these unwavering, glowing points of attention. It felt like we were being studied, sized up. I tried to make out shapes behind the eyes, but there was nothing. Just a deeper blackness. It was like the creatures, whatever they were made of the night itself, and only their eyes gave them away. The sheer size of them, implied by the height of those eyes, was making my stomach clench. These weren't small animals. Then, the driver did the smartest thing he could have done. Without a word, and moving so slowly it was painful, he turned the key in the ignition. The engine cranked, the sound obscenely loud in the silence. The headlights blazed on, flooding the area in front of us with white light. For a split second, we saw nothing. Just the beam of light hitting the first few trees at the edge of the drop-off. The eyes were gone, vanished. It was like they'd never been there. But they had been. We all saw them. "Go," my brother said, his voice cracking. "Go, go, go." The driver didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the gear shift into drive and punched the gas. The tires spun on the gravel for a heart-stopping second before catching, and the SUV lurched forward onto the pavement. He didn't even bother to turn on his headlights for a second. He was so desperate to get away. We sped down that dark highway, the forest a blur on either side. Nobody spoke for a full 5 minutes. The only sounds were the roar of the engine and the ragged breathing of the four of us. I kept looking in the side mirror, expecting to see those orange dots following us, floating through the trees alongside the road. I saw nothing but darkness. Finally, my brother broke the silence. His hands were trembling. "You saw them too, right?" he asked the driver. "Tell me you saw them." The driver just nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I saw them. I saw all of them." He looked like he was about to be sick. There were so many. The friend in the back with me had his head in his hands. He was still shaking. He muttered something about it being a bear, but it was a weak, desperate attempt to rationalize something that was beyond rational. Bears don't stand in a silent, coordinated circle, 8 of them, with glowing eyes 6 feet off the ground. They just don't. We were all trying to process it, talking over each other in rushed, panicked sentences. "Did you see how high up they were?" They were just staring. "Why didn't they move?" They knew we were there. They were waiting. That was the worst part. The feeling of being expected. It wasn't a random encounter. I had been there days before, and I'd heard them. And now, when I came back, they were waiting. Had they been watching me on Monday too? From the darkness where I couldn't see them, the driver, trying to get a grip, said the only thing that made any sense: "We have to go back. With cameras. With something. We can't just let this go." My brother agreed immediately. "Saturday. We'll come back on Saturday. During the day. With my DSLR and the GoPro, we'll..." We'll document this. It sounded so logical there in the lit-up cab of the SUV, putting distance between us and that pull-off, a plan, a follow-up. But even as we were saying it, I think we all knew. We weren't going back to prove anything. We were going back because we had to know. We had to try and understand what had been watching us with such silent, terrifying intensity. We drove the rest of the way home in near silence, each of us lost in our own version of what just happened. The casual night was gone, replaced by this cold, heavy dread that sat in the pit of my stomach. I dropped my friends off, and my brother and I just looked at each other before he got out at his place. No words, just a look that said everything. We had seen something that shouldn't exist. I got home and locked my door, something I never usually do. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, jumping at every little creak the house made. I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes, that pervasive presence. It felt like they had seen more than just our car. It felt like they had seen us, who we were, and that the memory of us was now out there in those woods. We had a plan to go back on Saturday with equipment, in the daylight. It felt like a solid plan, a way to take back control. But right then, sitting alone in my brightly lit house, the memory of those 8 pairs of unmoving, glowing orange eyes, staring out from the total blackness. It didn't feel like we were the ones in control at all. It felt like we had stumbled into someone else's territory, and we had been politely but very firmly told to leave. And that was it. That was the whole thing. We drove up, we stopped, we saw the eyes, and we ran. It sounds simple when you say it like that, but it wasn't simple. It was the most scared I have ever been in my entire life. I still don't know what they were. I don't have a picture. I don't have any proof. All I have is the memory of that circle of light in the darkness, and the cold, certain knowledge that we were not alone out there, and that whatever was with us was big, it was smart, and it was watching. Story 13. I'd been at my parents' place in London, Missouri, for 3 days when it happened. It was the middle of July, hot and sticky in that way where the air feels thick, like you're breathing through a wet cloth. My son was 4 years old then, a little ball of energy with curly hair that was always a mess. We'd driven down from Warrenburg, a trip that took the better part of a day in my beat-up sedan, just me and him. My folks had a quiet house, lots of land around it, the kind of place that feels peaceful until the sun starts to go down. That afternoon, I was out on the back deck with my boy. He was playing with a set of plastic dinosaurs, making them fight in the cracks between the deck boards. I was just sitting in an old lawn chair, sipping sweet tea and watching him. The deck was up maybe 4 feet off the ground, with a set of wooden steps leading down into the backyard. Beyond that, the yard sloped away into a tangle of trees and underbrush that seemed to go on forever. My dad always said the woods were deep, that you could walk for an hour and not see another house. The dog, a mutt named Buddy my parents had for years, was lying near my feet, panting in the heat. Everything felt slow and hazy. I remember the smell of cut grass and the faint, sweet rot of leaves from the woods. I was watching a dragonfly hover over the railing, its wings catching the light, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a deer. We got a lot of deer out there. But this was different. It was taller, and it was walking on 2 legs. It came out from the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, moving toward the house. It was covered in hair, long and white, almost silvery in the afternoon sun. It wasn't walking fast, just this steady, calm pace, like it had somewhere to be and wasn't in a rush. My heart just dropped. I mean, it felt like it fell straight through my chest and into my stomach. I didn't even think. I just moved. I scooped my son up, dinosaurs and all, and I practically threw us both through the sliding glass door into the house. He started to cry, more from the sudden movement than anything else, because he hadn't seen it. I fumbled with the lock on the door, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get it to slide shut. I set him down on the rug in the living room, telling him it was okay, that Mommy just saw a big animal, but my voice was trembling. I looked back out the glass door. The thing was still coming. It was closer now, maybe 30 yards from the deck. Buddy was going crazy, but not in a barking way. He was whining, this low, scared sound from the back of his throat, and he'd crawled under one of the deck chairs, trying to make himself small. His whole body was shaking. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter, my fingers slipping on the screen. I didn't even know who to call. The police? And say what? There's a tall, hairy thing in my backyard? It sounded insane, even in my own head. So I just stood there, phone in my hand, watching it. It didn't seem to notice us, or if it did, it didn't care. It walked right up to the deck. I held my breath. It was so close I could see the way its hair moved as it walked, not like fur on a dog, but thicker, coarser. It had a slight hunch to its shoulders, like it was carrying a weight. It must have been 5.5, maybe 6 feet tall. It didn't climb the steps onto the deck. Instead, it walked calmly along the edge of the yard, right next to this short, decorative white fence my mom had put in to border her flower beds. That's when it turned its head and looked right at me, through the glass, right into my eyes, and everything just stopped. The fear, the panic, the frantic beating of my heart, it all just melted away. It was the strangest feeling, like warm water washing through me. I wasn't scared anymore. I was just calm, completely and utterly at peace. Its eyes were huge and black, like pools of oil, but they weren't empty. They were deep, and they looked sad. There was a weight in them, a kind of ancient sadness that I can't even describe. It felt like it was looking right into me, not at me, but into the core of who I was. It only lasted for a few seconds, that look, but it felt like a lifetime. In that moment, there was no thought of it being a monster, or a beast, or anything to be afraid of. It was just a being, and it was sharing something with me without a single word, a feeling, a deep, profound sorrow, and a kind of quiet acceptance. Then it turned its head back, continued its slow walk along the fence, and disappeared behind the garage. I stood there for a full minute, maybe more, just staring at the empty space where it had been. The calm feeling lingered, a soft warmth in my chest. My son had quieted down and was pulling on my pant leg, asking for his juice. Buddy was still under the chair on the deck, but he'd stopped whining. I unlocked the sliding door and stepped back out onto the deck. The air felt different, lighter. I walked to the railing and looked toward the garage. Nothing. It was just gone. I went down the steps and walked over to the spot where it had been, near the flower bed. The grass was trampled a little, but that was it. No footprints that I could see. It was like it had never been there at all, except I knew it had. I could still feel the echo of that calm in my bones. I got Buddy to come out from under the chair. He was skittish for the rest of the day, sticking close to my heels inside the house. I tried to go back to normal. I got my son his juice, turned on the TV for him, but my mind was a million miles away. I kept replaying those few minutes in my head. The initial jolt of terror, so primal and sharp it made my teeth ache, the frantic scramble to get my child to safety, and then that look, that impossible, peaceful, heartbreaking look. Later that evening, after I'd put my son to bed, I sat down at the computer in my dad's study. The house was quiet. I started searching online. I didn't even know what to type in at first. Tall, white, hairy creature, Missouri. The results were a mess of weird websites and blurry photos. But then I found a forum, a place where people talked about seeing strange things in the woods. I read story after story. A lot of them were about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, but most described them as brown or dark-haired. Then I found a few threads, tucked away, about something called the Yeti, or white Bigfoot. People describing exactly what I saw. A tall, bipedal creature covered in long white or light grey hair. Sightings were rare, but they happened. My hands were cold as I read. It wasn't just the description, it was the feelings people described. A lot of them talked about fear, sure, but a surprising number mentioned this same thing, a moment of connection, a feeling of calm or sadness, or a kind of silent communication when they made eye contact. I wasn't crazy. Other people had felt this. That's when the other memories surfaced, one I'd completely forgotten about. A couple of years before, when my son was just learning to talk in sentences, we were visiting my parents in the winter. There was a light snow on the ground. He'd been looking out his bedroom window, the one that faced the woods, and he'd said, "Mama, look at the big snowman in the trees." I'd been busy packing our stuff to leave, and I'd just humored him. "Oh yeah, buddy, a big snowman?" "He's hairy," my son had said, his little face pressed to the glass, "and he's walking away." I'd dismissed it completely. A kid's imagination, a weird shadow in the trees. I never gave it a second thought, until now, sitting in the dark study, the glow of the computer screen, the only light, he'd seen it too. He'd seen the same thing or something like it, and his young mind had filed it away as a funny snowman, and he'd forgotten about it like kids do. But I hadn't forgotten, I couldn't. I stayed up most of that night, just sitting by the window in the living room, looking out at the dark backyard. The woods were just a black wall. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart jump, but not with the same fear as before. It was a different kind of tension, a waiting. I kept expecting to see those dark, sad eyes looking back at me from the tree line. I wanted to see them again. That's the part that messed with my head the most. The terror was real, but the curiosity, the need to understand that feeling of peace, was stronger. The next week, we finished our visit and drove back to Warrenburg. Life went back to normal. Work, daycare, grocery shopping, but I was different. I'd look at the trees lining the park near our apartment and wonder what was just out of sight. I'd watch people on the street and feel this strange disconnect, like I was carrying a secret that separated me from everyone else. I never saw it again. I've been back to my parents' place plenty of times since then, and I always find myself staring out at those woods, especially in the late afternoon. Part of me is always looking for a glimpse of white movement in the shadows. My son is older now, and he doesn't remember the snowman or the day on the deck. He just knows his mum gets a little quiet sometimes when we're at Grandma and Grandpa's house. I don't know what it was. A Bigfoot, a Yeti, something else entirely. The names don't really matter. What matters is what happened in that one moment when it looked at me. It wasn't a confrontation, it wasn't a threat. It was an acknowledgement. I was a mother protecting her child, and it was just passing through. And in its eyes I saw a loneliness so vast and so old, it made my own problems feel tiny. I felt a connection to something wild and ancient, something that exists just beyond the edges of our understanding. That feeling, that profound, quiet mystery, is what I'm left with. It's been years and I still can't explain it. I don't think I ever will. I just know that for a few seconds on a hot July afternoon, I was more afraid than I've ever been. And then, in the space of a single glance, I wasn't afraid at all. And sometimes, late at night, the memory of those big, black, sad eyes comes back to me, and I'm filled with this weird, aching sense of wonder and a chill that has nothing to do with the cold. Story 14. Okay, so I've been sitting on this for a while, but I need to get it out there because it's been eating at me. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or monsters or anything like that. I'm just a regular person, a mom who drives her kids around and tries to keep life normal. But what happened on that road by the river has left me with this deep, crawling feeling that I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. It was a Tuesday evening, around 6 o'clock, and I was driving home from Yaka with my 2 daughters in the car. We'd spent the afternoon there running errands, and the girls were tired, slumped in the back seat with their headphones on, probably watching videos or something. I was just focused on the road, like always. This stretch of road runs right alongside the river, and it's one of those places where you can't help but glance down at the water every now and then. I've always done it, looking for deer coming down to drink, or eagles perched in the trees, or even just the way the light hits the water. It's peaceful, or it used to be. That evening, the sky was starting to get dark earlier because fall was coming on, and there was a chill in the air that made me roll up the windows. The trees along the riverbank were thick with leaves, but you could still see patches of the water through the gaps. I had the radio on low, just some background noise, and I was driving at a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow. My mind was on dinner and what I needed to do when we got home, normal stuff. Then, out of nowhere, my eyes caught something down by the river. It was like my brain registered it before I even knew what I was seeing. Two large, dark figures standing side by side right at the water's edge, behind some bushes. My foot hit the brake before I could think, and the car slowed down abruptly. The girls stirred in the back, one of them asking, "Mom, what's wrong?" But I didn't answer. I was too busy staring, my heart starting to pound in my chest, because this wasn't the first time I'd seen something like that. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been driving into Yaka on this same road, with the girls in the car, and I'd seen a single figure, just one but big and dark, standing in almost the same spot. That time I'd hit the brakes and backed up to get a better look, but it was gone, vanished into thin air. The girls had teased me about it, saying I was imagining things, that it was probably a bear or a trick of the light. I'd laughed it off too, but part of me felt unsettled, like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. Now here I was, seeing two of them, and they were bigger than I remembered from that first time. One was about 1.5 feet taller than the other, both of them broad-shouldered and solid-looking, like they were made of shadow or something. They were just standing there, not moving, facing the water. The taller one seemed to loom over the shorter one, and even from the road, I could tell they were massive, way bigger than any person I've ever seen. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, and I could feel this cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I slowed the car to almost a stop, my eyes glued to them. The girls were asking questions again, but their voices sounded distant, like they were coming from another room. All I could focus on was those figures. I remember thinking, what are they? But nothing made sense. They didn't look like bears. Bears don't stand upright like that, and they're not that tall or broad. And it wasn't a person. No one stands that still, or looks that imposing. The darkness of them seemed to absorb the light around them, making them stand out against the graying evening sky. Without thinking, I put the car in reverse and backed up a little, trying to get a clearer view. The road isn't wide, so I had to be careful, but my instincts were screaming at me to look again, to make sure I wasn't crazy. As I backed up, the figures were still there for a second, and then, poof, they were gone. Just like that. One moment they were standing there, and the next there was nothing but empty riverbank and bushes swaying slightly in the breeze. I felt this jolt of pure fear shoot through me. My stomach dropped, and I had to take a deep breath to keep from panicking. The girls were quiet now, sensing that something was wrong. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I put it in park. I just sat there for a minute, staring at the spot where they'd been, half expecting them to reappear. But there was nothing. The river flowed on, calm and undisturbed, and the trees rustled like they always do. I turned to look at my daughters. Their faces were pale, and the younger one had her arms wrapped around herself. "Mom, what did you see?" the older one asked, her voice small. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain something like that? I just shook my head and said, "Nothing, honey, probably just some shadows." But we all knew I was lying. The air in the car felt heavy, charged with this unspoken fear. I started driving again, but my eyes kept darting back to that spot by the river. Every little movement in the trees made my heart skip a beat. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up, and my skin was crawling with this eerie sensation, like I was being watched. The rest of the drive home was silent, none of us saying a word. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures following us, but the road behind us was empty. When we got home, I tried to act normal, but I was rattled. I made dinner, helped the girls with their homework, but my mind was stuck on what I'd seen. Later that night, after the girls were in bed, I told my husband about it. He's usually the skeptical type, laughs off ghost stories and thinks Bigfoot is a joke. So I expected him to brush it off, but when I described the figures, his face went serious. He didn't say anything at first, just listened, and then he told me that a few months back, he'd been driving on that same road early in the morning and saw something similar, a large, dark shape moving quickly through the trees by the river. He said it was too big to be a person and too fast to be a bear, and it gave him the creeps so bad he sped up and didn't look back. Hearing that from him, someone who never takes this stuff seriously, made my blood run cold. It was like this confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that something really was out there. Since that day, I can't drive that road without my eyes constantly scanning the riverbank. Every time I pass that spot, my heart rate picks up, and I feel this tightness in my chest. I've never seen them again, and part of me is relieved, but another part is always waiting, always watching. The mystery of it haunts me. What were those things? Why were they there? And why did they disappear like that? I don't have any answers, and maybe I never will. All I know is that whatever I saw, it was real, and the fear of it is still with me, like a shadow I can't shake. Story 15. Okay, so I've been sitting on this for a while now, and I don't really know how to start, but I need to get it out there. Maybe typing it all down will help me make sense of it, or maybe it'll just freak me out even more. I'm not sure. But here goes nothing. It was last summer, around the end of July, and I was working with a crew up in Zoo Lookout, Ontario. If you don't know where that is, it's way out in the middle of nowhere, about 400 kilometers northwest of Thunder Bay. It's all dense forest, lakes, and not much else. Just the kind of place where you can go days without seeing another soul, which is usually why I like the job. I've been a forest firefighter for about 5 years now, and most of the time it's hard work, but straightforward. You show up, you fight the fire, you go home. But this one day was different. I still get chills thinking about it, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling since. We'd been out there for a couple of days already, battling a pretty nasty blaze that had sparked up after a dry spell. The air was thick with smoke, and everything had that hazy orange glow that makes your eyes sting after a while. That morning, we were working a section near a creek bed. The ground was mostly dry mud and ash, with patches of scorched earth where the fire had already passed through. It was hot, even for summer, and the wind was picking up, which always makes things more dangerous. You're constantly watching for shifts in the fire, listening for the crackle of flames getting closer, and trying to stay hydrated. My gear felt heavy, and my face was covered in soot and sweat. I remember wiping my forehead with the back of my glove and tasting the grit in my mouth. It was just another grueling day, or so I thought. There were 4 of us in my immediate team, no names because we all kind of blend together out there, and it doesn't really matter who was who. We'd been hiking through this area, using shovels and axes to clear away brush and create fire breaks. The goal was to stop the fire from spreading further into a denser part of the forest. We were all focused, heads down, working in silence most of the time, because talking over the roar of the fire and the wind was pointless. You just communicate with hand signals or short shouts if you need to. I remember one of the guys pointing ahead to a spot where the mud looked darker, almost like it had been untouched by the fire. We decided to check it out, make sure there weren't any hotspots hiding there. As we got closer, I noticed something odd in the mud. At first I thought it was just a depression from a fallen branch or maybe an animal track. We see deer and bear prints all the time out here, but this was different. It was huge, way bigger than anything I'd ever seen. I stopped in my tracks, and my heart started pounding like it was trying to break out of my chest. I waved over one of the other guys, and he came up beside me. We both just stared at it for a second, not saying anything. The print was sunk deep into the dry mud, about as long as my forearm from elbow to wrist, and wide enough that I could have fit both my boots inside it with room to spare. The edges were crisp, like it had been made recently, before the mud dried out. I crouched down to get a better look, and that's when the fear really started to set in. My hands were shaking a little, and I had to steady myself on one knee. The print had 5 toes, but they weren't arranged like a bear's. Bears have more rounded prints, and this one was elongated, almost human-like, but way too big. The toes were thick, and the arch was deep, like whatever made it was heavy. Really heavy. I could see the details in the mud. Little cracks where it had dried, and the way the toes had pressed down unevenly, like the thing had been walking slowly. My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a moose. But moose prints are hooved. Not like this, or a big bear. But bears don't leave prints this size, not even grizzlies. I've seen plenty of those, and this was something else entirely. One of the other guys pulled out his phone. We're not supposed to have them on during active firefighting, but sometimes we keep them for emergencies. He started taking pictures, his hands fumbling a bit because he was wearing thick gloves. The flash went off, and in that moment, everything felt surreal. Here we were in the middle of a forest fire, with smoke swirling around us, and we're staring at this massive footprint that shouldn't exist. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, and a cold sweat broke out under my gear. Even though it was scorching hot, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see something moving in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind howling and the distant crackle of the fire. We decided to measure it properly. One of the guys had a tape measure in his pack, and we laid it out next to the print. It was 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. 18 inches. I'm not a small guy. I wear a size 12 boot, and this thing was almost twice as long. We took more pictures from different angles, trying to capture the scale. I remember my fingers feeling numb as I held the tape, and my breath was coming in short pants. It wasn't just the physical exertion, it was the sheer weirdness of it all. We're trained to handle emergencies, to stay calm under pressure, but this was outside anything we'd ever dealt with. It felt like we'd stumbled into some kind of nightmare. As we were documenting it, I couldn't help but think back to stories I'd heard from other firefighters or locals about strange things in the woods. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I'd always brushed it off as nonsense, campfire tales to scare newbies. But standing there, looking at that print, it didn't feel like a story anymore. It felt real. And that's when the terror really kicked in. My stomach was in knots, and I had this overwhelming urge to get out of there, to run back to the truck and drive away. But we had a job to do, and the fire was still burning. We couldn't just leave. We spent the next hour or so working around that area, but my focus was gone. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, and I kept scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. The others felt it too. I could see it in their eyes. We didn't talk much, but when we did, it was in hushed tones. One of them said, "What do you think made that?" And I just shook my head. I didn't have an answer. Another guy mentioned that he'd heard something big moving through the trees the night before, but he'd assumed it was a moose or something. Now he wasn't so sure. The wind picked up even more, and the fire started to shift direction, so we had to move to a safer spot. As we packed up our gear, I took one last look at that footprint. It was like it was staring back at me, a silent reminder that there are things out here we don't understand. We hiked back to our base camp, which was a cleared area where we had trucks and supplies set up. The whole way, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was probably just my imagination, but it felt so real. My heart was still racing, and my palms were sweaty inside my gloves. When we got back, we showed the pictures to the crew boss. He looked at them for a long time, then just shrugged and said, "Probably a bear." But I could tell he was uneasy too. He told us to focus on the fire and not let it distract us. Easier said than done. For the rest of the day, every time I heard a branch snap or saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I'd freeze for a second. The normal sounds of the forest, birds, animals, the wind, seemed louder, more menacing. It was like the woods had suddenly become a different place, one where I didn't belong. We worked until dusk, when the light started to fade, and it became too dangerous to stay out. By then, the fire was mostly contained, but we were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. As we drove back to the main camp, no one talked about the footprint. It was like we'd all silently agreed not to bring it up, as if saying it out loud would make it more real, but I could feel the tension in the truck. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling of the trailer, going over everything in my head. The image of that footprint was burned into my mind. I kept thinking about how deep it was, how fresh it looked, and the size. It was just impossible. I thought about the stories I'd heard, about Bigfoot sightings in remote areas like this, and for the first time, I wondered if there might be some truth to them. It wasn't a comforting thought. I felt a cold dread sitting in my chest, and every little noise outside made me tense up. At one point, I heard something heavy moving around the perimeter of the camp, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. Probably just an animal, but my mind went straight to that footprint. The next day, we went back to the same area to do some mop-up work, but the print was gone. The wind had blown ash and debris over it, or maybe the rain that came later had washed it away. We didn't find any other signs, no more prints, no hair, nothing. It was like it had never been there. But I had the pictures on my phone, and I've looked at them 100 times since. They're blurry and not great quality, but you can still see the size and shape. I've shown them to a few people, but most just say it's a bear or a hoax. But I know what I saw, and I know how it felt. To this day, I can't explain it. I've been back in the woods since then, on other fires, and I've never seen anything like it again. But that one day changed something in me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings, and sometimes when I'm out there alone, I'll get this feeling, like I'm not alone, and I'll remember that footprint in the mud. It's been months, but it still haunts me. I don't know what it was, and maybe I never will. All I know is that out there in the deep woods, there are things we don't understand, and that thought is enough to keep me up at night. Story 16. Okay, so I'm O. Edwards from Fresno, California, and this happened back during World War II, when I was just a young man. I've never really talked about this much, not even to my family, because honestly, who would believe me? But lately, I've been seeing stuff online about weird encounters, and it got me thinking, maybe I'm not the only one. So here goes nothing. It was a crisp autumn day. I remember that much. The war was on, and things were tight everywhere, so my friend Bill Cole and I decided to go hunting up in the southern Sierras, the Sisio Mountains specifically. We weren't soldiers or anything, just a couple of guys trying to put some extra meat on the table for our families. Bill was a good buddy, steady as they come, and we'd been hunting together since we were kids. That day we left Fresno before sunrise, driving his old truck up into the foothills. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth, and the sky was that deep blue you only get in the mountains. We parked off a dirt road and hiked in, carrying our rifles and a pack with some water and sandwiches. The plan was to stalk deer, maybe bag one if we were lucky. We moved real slow and quiet, the way you do when you're hunting, stepping careful over twigs, keeping our voices low when we talked. The woods were thick there, lots of brush and tall trees, with the sun filtering through in patches. It was peaceful, you know, the kind of day that makes you forget about the war and all the bad stuff happening overseas. We'd been at it for a couple of hours, not seeing much, just some squirrels and birds. Then, around mid-morning, we came up on this big brush patch. It was dense, like a wall of manzanita and scrub oak, and we figured maybe something was hiding in there. I was leading with Bill a few steps behind me. We were moving silent, barely breathing, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear. We'd seen bears up there before. But then I saw it clear, an ape-like head sticking out from behind a thicket. I froze, my heart just pounding in my chest. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. The head was huge, covered in dark, matted hair, and it had these deep-set eyes that seemed to look right through me. I couldn't make out much detail, but it was unnerving as hell. Without thinking, I dashed forward to get a better view, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. Bill hissed at me to stop, but I was already at the edge of the brush patch, and that's when I saw it full on. This creature was standing there, maybe 7 feet tall, all covered in shaggy, brownish black hair. It was built like a man, but bulkier, with massive shoulders and arms that hung down past its knees. But the worst part was what it was carrying. Slung over its shoulder was what looked like a person, a man, I think, because I could see legs dangling, and shoes, actual shoes like work boots, scuffed and dirty. The legs were limp, just swaying as the creature moved. My brain just short-circuited. I mean, I'd heard stories about Bigfoot or whatever, but this was different. This thing was real, and it had a person. For a second, I thought maybe it was a hunter it had attacked, but it all happened so fast. The creature turned its head toward me, and I swear its eyes locked with mine. They were dark, almost black, and there was this intelligence in them that made my skin crawl. Then it took off, running downhill with this weird, loping gait that was way too fast for something that size. It moved like it was part of the forest, dodging trees and rocks like they weren't even there. I was too shocked to do anything. My rifle felt heavy in my hands, but I didn't raise it. I just stood there, staring, my mouth hanging open. Bill came up beside me, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. But I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe the stress of the war was getting to me. So I closed my eyes tight, squeezing them shut, thinking that when I opened them again, it would all be gone, just a trick of the light or something. But when I looked again, the creature was still there, farther down the slope now, almost at the tree line. It was still carrying that person. The legs were still visible, and one of the shoes had come loose, I think, because I saw it bounce off a rock. Then, in a blink, it disappeared into the thick woods, just vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. No birds chirping, no wind, just this heavy, oppressive quiet. Bill grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Oh, what did we just see?" he said, his voice shaky. I shook my head, still not believing it myself. We stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the spot where it had been. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, even though the air was cool. I kept expecting to hear something, a scream maybe, or more movement, but there was nothing. After a minute, we started down the hill, moving slow and cautious. I had my rifle ready now, finger near the trigger, but I didn't know what I'd shoot at. When we got to where the creature had been, we looked around. The ground was messed up, trampled grass, broken branches, and there was this smell. It's hard to describe, but it was musky, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I bent down and saw footprints, huge footprints, bigger than any bear's, with 5 toes and a deep impression in the soft earth. They led off into the trees, and we followed them for a bit. But they faded out after a dozen yards or so. We found that shoe too. It was a leather work boot, worn down at the heel, and it was just lying there on the ground. I picked it up. It felt cold and damp. There was no blood or anything, but it gave me chills. Who did it belong to? Was there really a person out here taken by that thing? Bill and I looked at each other, and I could see the same fear in his eyes. We didn't say much. We just knew we had to get out of there. We hiked back to the truck as fast as we could, not talking, just listening for any sounds behind us. Every little noise, a twig snapping, a bird taking flight, made me jump. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold my rifle. When we got to the truck, we threw our gear in the back and got the hell out of there. Driving down the mountain, the sun was high in the sky, but it felt like the world had gone dark. Bill kept glancing in the rearview mirror, like he expected to see that thing chasing us. We didn't report it to anyone. Who would we tell? The police. They'd think we were crazy, especially with the war on and everyone on edge. Plus, what would we say? That we saw a Bigfoot carrying a man? It sounded insane even to us. So we made a pact to keep it quiet, and for the most part, we did. Bill passed away a few years back, and I've carried this with me ever since. That day changed me. I never went hunting in those mountains again, and every time I hear a story about something strange in the woods, I think back to that moment. The image of that creature, with its hairy body and those intelligent eyes, carrying what looked like a human being. It's burned into my brain. I still have nightmares about it, waking up in a cold sweat, feeling like I'm back there, frozen in place. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a bear with some odd deformity, or a guy in a costume. But who would be out in the middle of nowhere carrying another person? And the speed, the sheer size of it. It wasn't human, I know that much. Sometimes I wonder if that person survived, or if there were others, but I'll never know. All I have is that memory, and the chill that runs down my spine whenever I think about it. So yeah, that's my story. I've never written it down before, and honestly, it feels weird putting it out there. But if anyone else has seen something like that, maybe it'll help to know you're not alone. I still can't explain it. Not after all these years, and I doubt I ever will. Story 17. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and even now, years later, I still get this cold, hollow feeling in my chest when I think about that day. It was late September in Pennsylvania, one of those crisp, clear afternoons where the sun cuts through the pine trees in sharp, golden shafts, and the air smells like damp earth and dying leaves. I was maybe 14 years old, and my family's property backed up against a huge, untracked state forest. Miles and miles of nothing but trees, creeks, and silence. That day, I decided to climb one of the big white pines that grew near the edge of our yard. It was a monster of a tree, towering over everything else, and from the top, you could see for what felt like forever. I'd climbed it a dozen times before. It was my spot, my escape. I remember the rough texture of the bark against my palms, the way it scraped my skin as I hoisted myself up from one branch to the next. My dog, a goofy black lab mix named Bear, was with me, sniffing around the base of the tree before he trotted off into the underbrush, probably following the scent of a squirrel or a rabbit. I didn't think anything of it. I just kept climbing, focusing on my hands and feet, the familiar rhythm of it. The higher I got, the more the world opened up. I could see the roof of our house, the dirt driveway, the dark green ocean of the forest stretching out to the horizon. The wind was stronger up there, a steady sighing sound through the pine needles. It was peaceful, normal. Then I heard a sound below me. It was a rustling, a soft crunching in the layer of dead pine needles and leaves that carpeted the forest floor. I stopped climbing, my arms hooked over a thick branch, and listened. My first thought, my automatic thought, was that it was Bear. He'd circled back and was rooting around down there. The sound was coming from almost directly beneath the tree, in the deep shadow where the branches blocked the sun. I shifted my weight, trying to peer down through the lattice of branches. It was hard to see anything. The lower part of the tree was a mess of dead, dry limbs, a tangle of brown against the darker brown of the earth. "Bear?" I called out, my voice sounding small and thin in the vastness of the woods. There was no happy bark in response, no jingling of his collar, just the continued rustling. It was a slow, deliberate sound, not the frantic, excited scrabbling of a dog chasing something. This was heavier, more purposeful. A little prickle of unease went down my spine. Maybe it was a deer. We had plenty of them. But deer usually moved with a lighter step, and they didn't usually linger right under a tree like that. They'd hear you and bolt. I was about to call for Bear again when I heard him, his bark. It was distant, coming from the west, down near the creek bed. A good couple 100 yards away, a solid, clear, "I'm over here" kind of bark. My blood went cold. If Bear was down by the creek, then what the hell was moving around under my tree? The rustling stopped for a second, as if whatever it was had heard Bear too. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. It was a listening silence. I held my breath, my fingers gripping the branch so tight the rough bark dug into my skin. My heart was starting to thump against my ribs, a dull, quick rhythm. Then the rustling started again, a single, slow crunch, then another. It was right below me. Panic started as a tight ball in my stomach. I felt exposed. I was stuck up a tree, and something I couldn't see was directly underneath me. My mind raced through the possibilities. A bear? Could be. We had black bears, but they were usually shy. A person? That seemed even less likely. Who would be crawling around on their hands and knees in the dirt under a pine tree? I needed to see. I needed to scare it off. There was a dead branch near my shoulder, about as thick as my wrist and maybe 2 feet long. It was brittle and dry. Without really thinking, acting purely on a surge of adrenaline and fear, I snapped it off. The crack of the wood was unnaturally loud in the quiet. I leaned out, aiming for the spot where the sound was coming from, and I dropped the branch. It fell, tumbling end over end, clattering through the living branches below before it vanished into the shadows. What happened next is burned into my memory with a clarity that still makes my hands shake. The second that branch hit the ground, something exploded out from under the tree. I don't mean it ran. I don't mean it trotted away. It exploded. It moved with a speed that was just impossible. It was a blur of dark brown and a shocking, powerful motion. There was no grace to it, no fluidity like a deer. This was raw, brutal acceleration. It was like watching a cannon go off. It burst from the deep shadows right at the base of the trunk and shot out into the slightly more open forest. The sheer force of its movement shook the entire tree. I felt the vibration through the branch I was clinging to. Pine needles rained down all around me. The whole thing lasted less than a second, a split-second glimpse. But in that fraction of a moment, I saw it. It was huge. That's the first thing that registered. It was massively built, taller than a man but hunched over as it ran. Its body was covered in what looked like shaggy, dark brown hair, matted and filthy. I didn't see its face. It was moving too fast, and it was already turning away from me. But I saw the shape of its head, blocky and set deep into powerful shoulders. I saw its arms, which were long and thick, swinging as it powered forward on 2 legs. It ran upright like a man, but no man ever moved like that. The musculature was all wrong, too dense, too powerful. The legs drove into the ground with a force that seemed to tear at the earth, and then it was gone. It vanished beneath the canopy of a dense stand of hemlocks 30 feet away. There was no sound of crashing through brush, no snapping twigs. 1 second it was there, a terrifying physical presence, and the next it was just absorbed by the forest. The silence rushed back in, but it was a different silence now. It was a watchful, predatory silence. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in that tree. It felt like an hour. It was probably only a minute or two. I was paralyzed, my body locked in place by a pure animal terror I had never felt before and have never felt since. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the fear of having seen something that shouldn't exist, something that broke the rules of the world I knew. My brain was screaming, trying to process the image of that thing, its size, its speed, its sheer physical wrongness. My heart was hammering so hard, I could feel it in my throat. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I was trembling, a full body shake that made my teeth chatter. I kept staring at the spot where it had disappeared, half expecting it to come charging back, but the forest was still, eerily still. Even the birds had stopped singing. Slowly, carefully, I started to climb down. My movements were clumsy and shaky. Every creak of the tree, every rustle of my own jacket sounded like a gunshot. My eyes never left the hemlock grove. I expected to see a pair of eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I expected it to be waiting. My descent felt like it took forever. Each time I lowered my foot to a new branch, I was terrified I'd feel a hand wrap around my ankle. The air felt thick and cold. The sunny, peaceful afternoon was gone, replaced by something dark and menacing. The woods I had known my whole life had become an alien and hostile place. When my feet finally hit the ground, my legs almost buckled. The earth felt unsteady. I stood there for a moment, my back pressed against the rough bark of the pine tree, scanning the woods. Nothing moved. The only sound was the distant, happy barking of my dog, Bear, who was still obliviously playing down by the creek. I looked at the spot where it had been. The layer of pine needles was torn up. There were deep, heavy impressions in the soft earth, not clean tracks, just disturbances, gouges. And a few feet away, lying innocently on the ground, was the branch I had dropped. I didn't go over to investigate. I didn't want to get any closer. The urge to run was overwhelming, a primal scream in my hindbrain, but I was afraid to turn my back on the woods. I inched my way along the tree line, keeping my eyes on the forest, until I was close enough to the house to feel a sliver of safety. And then I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning, not stopping until I was inside with the door locked behind me. I never told my parents. What would I have said? I saw a monster? They would have thought I had an overactive imagination, that I'd spooked myself in the woods. I tried to convince myself of that too. Maybe it was a bear, a weird, fast bear, but bears don't run on two legs like that. They don't have that kind of upper body mass, and they don't just vanish without a sound. For the rest of that fall and all through the winter, I didn't go into those woods alone. I'd look out my bedroom window at night, at the dark wall of trees, and feel a chill. I kept thinking about the speed of it. That was the most terrifying part. The way it moved was not of this world. It was a burst of pure, focused power, and it was gone before my mind could even fully register what it was. I never saw it again. I never found any clear tracks, never heard any strange calls at night. But I know what I saw. I know something was under that tree with me, watching me, and I dropped a branch on it. I provoked it, and the way it reacted, it wasn't the flight of a scared animal. It was the tactical, instantaneous retreat of something that knew exactly what it was doing, something that knew how to disappear. To this day, I can't explain it. I can't rationalize it away. All I have is that one blindingly fast image burned into my mind, and the cold, certain knowledge that I was not alone in the woods that day, and that the thing I was sharing the forest with was something I still can't name. Story 18. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes, just staring at this blank box. My hands shaking so bad I can barely type. My coffee's gone cold. Every time I try to put this into words, my heart starts hammering against my ribs all over again. I've read stories on here for years, always from the safety of my living room in Washington, thinking, wow, that's wild, but never really getting it. Not the deep-down, bone-level terror that changes how you see the world. Now I get it. and I wish to God I didn't. I'm Shannon. I grew up in St. Clair County, Alabama, way out in the sticks. Our backyard was thousands of acres of dense, dark forest. As kids, we lived in those woods. Me, my brothers and sisters, and our big Belgian shepherd. We'd be out from sunrise to sunset, building forts, following creeks. But even then, there were rules. Rules the woods seemed to make for themselves. Our dog would be trotting along, happy as anything, and then he'd just stop. His whole body would go stiff, his head would drop, and a low growl would rumble in his chest. He'd plant his feet and refuse to go one step further down a certain trail or into a particular thicket. We'd yell and tug on his collar, but he wouldn't budge. He'd just stare into the trees, his eyes wide. We learned to listen to him. He knew about the bears, the panthers. He could sense things we couldn't. At night, the sounds would start. It wasn't just the usual crickets and owls. Sometimes, from way off in the deep hollows, we'd hear this low growl that didn't sound like any animal we knew. It was too intelligent. It had a weight to it. Other times, it was these weird whooping calls, back and forth between two ridges, like two things were talking to each other. My dad would get quiet on those nights. He'd sit by the front door with his shotgun across his lap, not saying a word, just listening. The air itself would feel thick, and we'd all get goosebumps for no reason, the hair on our arms standing straight up. We just called it the feeling, and when it came, you stayed inside. As I got older, I started spending more time in the woods by myself, just me and my new dog, Molly, an Australian shepherd. She was my shadow, but she had the same sense as the old Belgian. We'd be walking, and I'd hear footsteps keeping pace with me from the ridge above. Not deer, deer are light and quick. These were heavy, deliberate thuds, crunching through the leaves, matching my stride exactly. Molly would stop walking, her ears pinned back, and she'd start this low, guttural growl that was completely different from her bark at a squirrel. Then she'd start nudging the back of my knees, hard, trying to herd me, to turn me around. She wasn't asking, she was telling, "Go home, now." I'd catch glimpses of movement too, just out of the corner of my eye. Something massive and dark shifting behind a tree, gone when I turned my head. I always told myself it was a trick of the light, a bear standing on its hind legs. But I never really believed it. Life moved on. I got married, had kids, moved away for a while, but in 2010, circumstances brought me back to that same house in St. Clair County, now with my own children. It felt different coming back as an adult, a parent. The woods felt bigger, darker. The feeling came back almost immediately. It all came to a head on one specific day. I remember it was a Tuesday in late October. The air was crisp, and the leaves were just starting to turn. The day itself was normal. The kids went to school, I did chores. But as the sun started to go down, that old familiar dread started to creep in. Molly, who was usually begging to go out for one last run, was glued to my side, whining softly. She kept pacing between me and the back door, her tail tucked between her legs. I put the kids to bed around 9. My daughter's room was at the back of the house, her window looking out into the sheer blackness of the woods. I remember tucking her in, her little nightlight casting long shadows. She asked me to leave the hall light on, and I did. I went to my own room, read for a bit, and eventually turned off my lamp. The house was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator. I must have dozed off, because the sound that woke me was so violent, so sudden, it felt like my heart stopped. Bang! It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a branch falling on the roof. It was a concussion, a massive, hollow boom that hit the side of the house so hard my entire bedroom shook. The windows rattled in their frames, plaster dust sifted down from the ceiling onto my face. I shot up in bed, my whole body instantly slick with a cold sweat. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there in the pitch black, frozen, my ears ringing. Bang! It hit again. Same spot. right on the wall of my daughter's room. The force of it vibrated through the floorboards. I heard a high-pitched, terrified whimper from the hallway. Molly was crouched there, frozen in fear. Then I heard my daughter's scream from her room, a raw, panicked sound that shattered the last of my paralysis. I scrambled out of bed, my legs so wobbly I almost fell. I didn't even think to turn on a light. I just ran, stumbling down the dark hallway and bursting into her room. She was sitting straight up in bed, screaming, pointing a trembling finger at her window. The man, the hairy man, he's at my window. My blood went cold. I rushed to her, pulling her into my arms, and looked over her shoulder at the window. The curtain was open. Outside was just pure, absolute blackness, but the window itself, it was covered in a filmy, greasy smear, like something huge and dirty had been pressed against the glass. And the feeling in that room, it was a physical pressure, a heavy, silent malevolence that pressed in on us from all sides. It smelled musky, like wet dog and old leaves and something else, something sour and wild. We weren't alone. The thought wasn't a question. It was a cold, hard fact that settled in my gut. Something was out there, and it knew we were in here. It had announced itself. I held my daughter, both of us trembling for what felt like an hour. Molly finally crept into the room and pressed herself against my legs, shaking. The banging didn't come again. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It was a listening silence. We were listening for it, and it was listening for us. Eventually, I carried my daughter into my room, and we all huddled in my bed. I didn't sleep a wink. I just stared at the dark shape of my bedroom door, clutching my phone, too terrified to even call the police. What would I say? Something big is hitting my house. They'd think I was crazy. The next morning, in the pale grey light, I forced myself to go outside. My hands were still shaking as I unlocked the back door. Molly refused to come with me. She stood in the doorway, whining. I walked around to the side of my daughter's room, and there they were, footprints. I felt the air leave my lungs. They were pressed deep into the soft, damp earth right beneath her window. They were enormous. I'm not talking about a big man in work boots. I mean, they were at least 3 times the size of my own foot. Long, wide, with clearly defined toes. They sank so deep I could see the individual wrinkles in the skin of the sole. I just stood there, staring, a cold nausea washing over me. This was real. This was physical proof. Something had stood right here, right outside my little girl's window, and slammed its hands, or whatever it had, against the wall of my house. The rest of the day was a blur of fear and forced normalcy. I got the kids off to school, my smile so brittle I thought it would crack my face. I called in sick to work. I couldn't stop pacing. Every creak of the house, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. Molly wouldn't leave my side. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it was like a physical touch on the back of my neck. That afternoon, I was in the kitchen, trying to eat a piece of toast I couldn't taste, when a sound started. It began low, like a distant train whistle, but then it rose, shifting in pitch. It was a howl, but unlike any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was sustained, powerful, and it had this weird, siren-like quality, warbling up and down the scale. It wasn't a call of the wild. It was a statement. It came from the ridge directly behind the house, and it felt like it was meant for us. Molly let out a terrified yelp and scrambled under the kitchen table. That sound did something to me. It broke through the last of my numb fear and replaced it with a shaky, desperate kind of courage. Or maybe it was just stupidity. I don't know. But I had to see. I had to know what was making that sound. I grabbed my dad's old baseball bat from the hall closet. It was a stupid, pointless gesture, but it made me feel a little better. I told Molly to stay, and I walked out the back door. The woods were dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels. It was that heavy, waiting silence again. I walked slowly, my ears straining, my heart thumping in my throat. I followed the tree line at the edge of our property, my eyes scanning the shadows under the dense pines. The air was cool, but I was sweating. I got to the spot where an old oak had fallen years ago, creating a huge, moss-covered log. It was a place I'd played as a kid. I was about to turn back, my nerve failing, when I saw it. Movement. About 50 yards away, just on the other side of the fallen log, something stood up. My brain short-circuited. It was tall, so much taller than a man, 7, maybe 8 feet. It was covered in long black hair that was matted and shaggy. Its head was conical, almost pointed at the top, and it sat directly on its broad shoulders with no real neck. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel it looking right at me. It was female. I don't know how I knew, but I was certain. Her body shape was different, wider in the hips. She was just standing there. One of her arms, long and heavily muscled, came up. She scratched the side of her face with fingers that looked too long, a slow, deliberate, almost human gesture. Time stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, gripping that useless baseball bat, staring at this thing that wasn't supposed to exist. There was no aggression in her posture. She just seemed curious, or maybe assessing. The sheer size of her, the raw, primal power she radiated, was overwhelming. This was what had been in our woods all my life. This was what had been watching us, following us, banging on our house. We stood like that for maybe 10 seconds. It felt like a lifetime. Then, in one fluid, silent motion, she turned and stepped behind the thick trunk of a pine tree. I blinked, expecting her to come out the other side. She didn't. I kept staring, waiting. Nothing. The space where she had been was just empty forest. She was just gone. I stumbled back to the house, my legs like jelly, my entire body trembling with a shock so deep I felt it in my teeth. I called some researchers I found online, guys who investigated this kind of thing. They came out, set up cameras and audio recorders. They got some chatter on the recorders. Weird clicks and guttural sounds they said were significant, but the cameras never caught anything, and after they left, the activity just stopped. The banging, the footprints, the howls. It was over. Like whatever it was had gotten what it wanted, acknowledgement, and moved on. We moved away not long after, first to Mississippi, and now I'm out here in the Pacific Northwest. But I never go into the woods anymore, not even a city park. That feeling, that deep primal terror, is still right there under my skin. I saw something that day that rewired my understanding of the world. I looked right at it, and it looked right back at me. And sometimes late at night, when the wind is just right, I still wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, listening for the sound of footsteps matching my own from some unseen ridge, waiting for the bang that never comes. Story 19. We were heading back to my neighborhood, the one off of, well, it doesn't matter the name. It was one of those suburban Orlando developments, all cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns that backed up against patches of old Florida woods. It was late, real late, the kind of late where the world is asleep and the only light comes from street lamps throwing these weird long shadows. The dashboard clock said it was just after 2 in the morning. My cousin was driving his beat-up old sedan. I was in the passenger seat, slumped against the window, feeling the hum of the engine and the chill from the AC. We were almost home when he flicked his turn signal. It made that slow clicking sound in the quiet car. "Gonna stop for a minute," he said, his voice rough. "Need a smoke." I just grunted. I didn't smoke, but he did. It was his thing. He pulled the car into this small parking area for a neighborhood playground. It was a place I knew well. We'd played there as kids. There was a swing set, a slide, a couple of those springy animal things, and beyond it, a small lake. More of a big pond, really. Surrounded by a thick line of trees, a single streetlight stood at the edge of the parking lot, casting a sickly orange glow that didn't so much illuminate things as it did make the darkness around it seem deeper. He put the car in park, but left the engine running. The headlights were off, but the parking lights were on, casting a dim light on the wood chips in front of us. I could see the outline of the swing set against the slightly less black sky. "Be right back," he mumbled, and opened his door. And the interior light flicked on, harsh and sudden, and then he closed the door, plunging me back into the dim, orange-tinted world of the car. I watched him walk to the front of the car, his back to me. He lit his cigarette, and the flare of the match was blinding for a second. I could see the smoke curl up in the still, humid air. It was dead quiet. No crickets, no frogs from the lake, nothing. Just the low, steady rumble of the car's engine. I remember thinking it was weird. That silence. Florida nights are never quiet. There's always something buzzing, croaking, chirping, but not tonight. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes for a second. I was tired. I could hear the faint sound of him shuffling his feet out there. I opened my eyes and just stared out the windshield. The playground looked different at night, kind of skeletal and lonely. Beyond it, the lake was a sheet of black glass, reflecting nothing. That's when I heard it. Not a sound from outside, but a change in the rhythm from my cousin. The shuffling stopped. I saw his posture go rigid. He was just standing there, frozen, facing away from me towards the lake. I sat up a little straighter, squinting. What was he looking at? Then he moved. It wasn't a calm, casual turn. It was a jerky, panicked spin. His face, in the faint light from the parking lamp, was a mask of pure, undiluted fear. His eyes were wide. His mouth was open. He dropped his cigarette. I saw the tiny orange ember hit the pavement and scatter. He fumbled for the car door handle. His hands were shaking so bad he couldn't get a grip. He was clawing at it, his fingers slipping. My heart, which had been beating slow and lazy, suddenly kicked into a frantic, pounding rhythm. My first thought was stupidly that a cop was there, but that didn't make sense. He wouldn't be this scared of a cop. "What?" I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the enclosed space. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He just kept scrabbling at the door handle, making these little choked sounds in his throat. That's when my eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror. The mirror was adjusted for me, so it showed the back window. And beyond that, the dark strip of road we'd just driven down. But that's not what I saw. Standing directly behind our car was a figure. My brain didn't process it at first. It was just a shape, a tall, dark shape that blocked out the view of the road. It was maybe 6-7 feet back from the bumper. Then the details started to click into place, one by one, each one hitting me like a physical blow. It was huge. I don't mean tall, I mean massive, broad. It was standing on 2 legs, completely upright. Its body was covered in hair, fur, something. It was dark, almost black. But in the dim orange streetlight, I could see it was wet-looking, matted, and through the fur, I could see muscles. I'm not kidding. I could see the definition of its shoulders, the thick cords of its arms, the powerful curve of its chest. It was solid, not like a person in a suit, not like a bear. It was built like a weightlifter, but on a scale that was just wrong. It was just standing there, and it was looking. I couldn't see its eyes, not yet, but I knew it was looking at my cousin, who was still frantically trying to get back into the car. A coldness washed over me, a cold that started in my gut and spread out to my fingers and toes. This wasn't fear like being scared of a test or getting in trouble. This was a primal, ancient fear, the kind that tells you are prey. My cousin finally yanked the door open and practically fell into the driver's seat. He slammed the door shut, the thunk sounding incredibly final and fragile. The interior light was on again, and in its white glare I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. He was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. "Go," I whispered. My own voice was gone, it was just air. He was fumbling for the gear shift, his hand shaking so violently he knocked it into neutral first. The engine revved, a loud, screaming sound in the silence. "What the fuck is that?" he hissed, his eyes locked on the rearview mirror. That broke my paralysis. I had to see it for myself. I couldn't just look in the mirror anymore. I had to turn and look with my own eyes. I forced my body to move, twisting in my seat, leaning over the center console to stare out the back window. And I saw it. I saw it clearly. It was still there, standing behind our car, and now it was looking right at us. Its head was turned, and its gaze was fixed on the car, on me in the window, its face. It wasn't a monkey's face. It wasn't a bear's face. It was flatter, broader. The mouth was a dark line, and the eyes, I will never forget the eyes. They weren't glowing red or anything like that. They were dark, intelligent, and in that split second, I saw an expression on its face that I can only describe as surprise. It looked as shocked to see us as we were to see it. Its head was tilted just slightly, as if it was trying to figure us out, this metal box with lights. We were locked in that stare for what felt like an hour, but was probably less than 2 seconds. The world had shrunk down to the inside of this car, and that thing outside the back window. My cousin found drive. The car lurched forward, the tires spitting gravel, and the moment the car moved, the creature moved. It didn't run like a man, it didn't lope like an ape, it exploded into motion. It was so fast it was a blur. In one fluid, powerful motion, it pivoted on its feet and bolted to the right, towards the tree line. It didn't make a sound, no roar, no crashing through the underbrush. It was just gone. It vanished into the wall of darkness between the trees so completely, it was like it had never been there at all. My cousin slammed his foot on the gas. The engine roared and the car shot out of the parking lot, swerving onto the residential street. He was driving way too fast, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the straining engine and our own harsh, panicked breathing. I was turned in my seat, staring out the back window, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break them. I expected to see it chasing us, a dark shape gaining on the car. But there was nothing. Just an empty, quiet street receding behind us. We didn't say a word for a full minute. We just drove, speeding through the sleeping neighborhood past identical houses with dark windows. "Did you see that?" my cousin finally gasped. It wasn't really a question. It was a plea for confirmation, for proof that he wasn't going insane. "Yeah," I managed to get out. My throat was dry as dust. I saw it. "What the hell was that?" His voice was rising, edged with hysteria. "Was that a bear?" "It wasn't a bear. It was standing up. It was looking at us." I just shook my head. I couldn't form the words. My mind was screaming one word, a word from campfire stories and cheesy TV shows, but I couldn't say it out loud. It felt too ridiculous, too impossible. We were almost to my house. He slowed down, his breathing starting to even out just a little. We looked at each other. In the dim light from the dashboard, I could see the same wild, confused terror in his eyes that I felt in my own gut. "We have to go back," I heard myself say. He stared at me. "Are you insane?" "We have to," I insisted. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a burning, desperate curiosity. We had seen something real. We couldn't just run home and hide under our beds. We had to know. We had to see if there was any trace of it. Just drive by, slowly, we don't get out." He hesitated, his hand still gripping the wheel tightly. Then he nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. He made a U-turn in the middle of the empty street, and we started driving back the way we came. The drive back felt 10 times longer. Every shadow between houses looked like a moving shape. Every tree seemed to be watching us. My whole body was tense, coiled like a spring. We approached the turnoff for the playground slowly, like we were creeping up on a sleeping animal. He turned into the entrance and stopped the car about 50 feet from the parking area. He left the engine running. We both stared. The playground was exactly as we had left it. The swing set, the slide, everything. The same orange streetlight cast the same sickly glow. The lake beyond was the same sheet of black. It was all perfectly normal, perfectly quiet. "Let's get closer," I whispered. He put the car in gear and we rolled forward, creeping at a walking pace. We came to a stop in the exact same spot we'd been parked before. The gravel our tires had kicked up was still there. His discarded cigarette butt was a dark smudge on the pavement. We sat there for a full 5 minutes, just staring, not speaking. We scanned the tree line, the playground, the surface of the lake. There was nothing, no sound, no movement, no broken branches, no footprints that we could see from the car. It was as if the last 10 minutes had never happened. The world had swallowed the evidence whole. The creature was gone. The fear, however, was not. It had taken root inside me, a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. My cousin finally put the car in reverse and backed out. We drove to my house in complete silence. We went inside, crept past my sleeping parents' room, and went to my bedroom. We didn't talk about it. We didn't try to rationalize it or explain it away. We just lay there in the dark, in our separate beds, staring at the ceiling. I don't think either of us slept a wink. The next morning, in the bright, unforgiving Florida sun, we went back. We walked all around that playground, the lake, the edge of the woods. We looked for footprints, for hair caught on a branch, for anything. The ground was hard-packed and dry. We found nothing, not a single sign. My cousin went back to Miami that afternoon. We never really talked about it again after that day. What was there to say? We both knew what we saw. It's been years now. I'm a grown man with a job, a life, all of that. But I've never forgotten. I can still feel the texture of the car's upholstery under my clutching fingers. I can still hear the frantic scratching of my cousin's nails on the door handle. I can still see the way the orange light glistened on that wet, matted fur, and the absolute intelligent shock in those dark eyes as it looked back at me. We were just a couple of kids in a car, and for a few seconds we shared a parking lot with something that wasn't supposed to exist. Something that looked at us and knew we were there, and then it was gone, leaving us with a silence that has never really been broken.